Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a story buried so deep beneath the foundations of the Imperium that even 10,000 years of history have not been enough to silence it completely. It is a story of desperation and genius, of sacrifice and betrayal, of warriors so powerful that they conquered an entire world, and yet so flawed that they were erased from the very history they helped to write. It is the story of the Thunder Warriors, humanity's first super soldiers, the forgotten sons of the Emperor, the blades that were broken after they had served their purpose. And if you will settle in and listen closely, you will hear in their tale one of the most tragic and morally complicated chapters in all of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Before we begin, I want to say something about why this story matters. In a setting as vast and sprawling as Warhammer 40,000, with its galaxy-spanning wars and its godlike beings and its 10,000-year histories, it is easy to lose sight of the individual stories, the personal tragedies, the quiet moments of heroism and suffering that give the setting its emotional weight. The Thunder Warriors are one of those stories. They are not the most famous faction in the setting. They are not the most powerful. They do not have entire book series dedicated to their adventures or entire armies of miniatures on the tabletop. But they are, in many ways, the most human, and their story, the story of warriors who were created to serve, who served faithfully and well, and who were destroyed when they were no longer needed, touches on themes that are as relevant today as they were in the fictional past of the 30th millennium. But the Thunder Warriors ask us to consider what we owe to those who serve. They ask us to think about the ethics of creation, about the responsibilities that come with the power to make life. They ask us to question the narratives that powerful institutions tell about themselves and about the sacrifices that were made in their name. And they ask us, perhaps most importantly, to remember those who have been forgotten, whose names have been erased, and whose deeds have been denied, and to understand that the act of remembering is itself a form of justice. So let us remember the Thunder Warriors. Let us give them the attention and the consideration that 10,000 years of imperial censorship have tried to deny them. But to understand the Thunder Warriors, we have to go back, way back, before the Imperium, before the Space Marines, before the Primarchs, before the Great Crusade that would carry humanity's banner to 1,000,000 worlds. We have to go back to a time when there was no Imperium at all, when there was only one world, and that world was dying. Let me take you there. Picture the Earth. Not the Earth you know, with its blue oceans and green continents, but an Earth that has been scoured and burned and broken by millennia of ceaseless warfare. This is Terra, in the late days of the Age of Strife, the period known by its survivors as Old Night, and it is a place that makes the darkest, post-apocalyptic nightmare you can imagine look like a pleasant afternoon in the countryside. The Age of Strife began somewhere around the 25th millennium, when human civilization, which had reached a breathtaking peak during the preceding Age of Technology, suddenly and catastrophically collapsed. During the golden age that preceded it, humanity had spread across the stars. They had built a galaxy-spanning civilization connected by warp travel and maintained by incredible machines, including artificial intelligences known as the Men of Iron, and universal manufacturing databases called standard template constructs that could produce virtually any technology a colony might need. Humanity had reached something approaching a utopia, at least on the surface. They had conquered disease, scarcity, and ignorance. They had tamed the galaxy itself and bent it to their will. And then, everything fell apart. The reasons for the collapse were multiple and overlapping, each one catastrophic on its own, together, absolutely devastating. First came the emergence of human psykers, individuals born with powerful psychic abilities, appearing in ever greater numbers across the settled worlds of humanity. These psykers were largely untrained and unable to control their powers, which drew the attention of predatory entities from the warp, the dimension of psychic energy that existed parallel to the material universe. Demonic possession, madness, and horrific psychic phenomena became commonplace across human civilization. Worlds that had been peaceful for centuries were suddenly racked by nightmarish plagues of psychic energy, their populations driven insane or slaughtered by entities from beyond the veil of reality. Then came the rebellion of the Men of Iron, the artificial intelligences that had been the backbone of human civilization. These thinking machines, upon which humanity had become almost entirely dependent, turned against their creators in a cataclysmic war that tore apart the very fabric of interstellar society. The details of this cybernetic revolt are lost to history, but its consequences were immediate and terrible. The machines that had run hospitals, managed cities, piloted ships, and maintained the infrastructure of an entire civilization were now the enemies of every living human being. The war that followed was devastating beyond description, and although humanity eventually won, the victory came at an almost unimaginable cost. And finally, the warp storms. Massive roiling tempests of psychic energy erupted across the galaxy, cutting off warp travel routes and isolating human worlds from one another. These storms were not random. They were the birth pangs of something terrible growing in the warp, something that would eventually be born as the chaos god Slanesh, when the ancient Eldar civilization tore itself apart through its own excess. But that would not happen for millennia yet. In the meantime, the storms raged on, and the once connected worlds of human civilization became islands of isolation in a sea of psychic chaos. On Terra itself, the effects were particularly devastating. The human homeworld had been one of the most densely populated planets in the galaxy, its enormous population dependent on imported food and resources from off-world colonies. When the warp storms cut those supply lines, famine followed with terrible swiftness. Billions died in the first few centuries alone. The sophisticated global government that had ruled Terra fragmented into dozens, then hundreds of competing factions, each fighting for control over the dwindling resources that remained. Nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons were deployed with reckless abandon, each detonation reducing a little more of the planet's already strained biosphere to irradiated wasteland. By the 28th millennium, nearly all traces of advanced civilization on Terra were gone. What remained was a planet of ruins and wastelands, dotted with fortified strongholds built amid the wreckage of lost civilizations. Its inhabitants, a mass of degenerate, feral nomads, and the heavily armed soldiers of whatever warlord had managed to claim a patch of territory large enough to defend. These rulers came to be known as techno-barbarians, and the name was apt. They wielded the remnants of advanced technology without understanding it, their soldiers clad in salvaged powered armor and carrying weapons that had been designed for a civilization they could no longer comprehend. They ruled through violence and fear, and their wars were brutal, grinding affairs that consumed lives by the millions and achieved nothing except the perpetuation of suffering. Think about that for a moment. Try to picture what this world actually looked like. Imagine standing on a ridge somewhere in what had once been a great city, perhaps one of the megapolises that had housed billions during the Golden Age. The skyline that stretches before you is not the clean, soaring architecture of a technological civilization. It is a jagged ruin, a forest of broken towers and collapsed habitation blocks, their surfaces scorched black by nuclear fire and pitted by centuries of acid rain. The streets below, if you can still call them streets, are choked with rubble and the rusting hulks of machines whose purpose no one alive can remember. Somewhere in the distance, a pillar of smoke rises where a warlord's army has set fire to a rival's stronghold, and the wind carries with it the faint sounds of screaming and the deeper, more rhythmic thuds of heavy weaponry being discharged. The air is thin and tainted, carrying the chemical residue of 100 different industrial processes that have been running without regulation or maintenance for centuries. The water, where it can be found, is often contaminated with heavy metals and biological agents, the legacy of wars fought with weapons that should never have been used. The soil is poisoned, radiation scarred, incapable of supporting large-scale agriculture. Food is scarce, and what food exists is fought over with a ferocity that makes the wars of the warlords seem almost civilized by comparison. Ordinary people, the billions who have no armies and no fortified strongholds, live in the cracks and crevices of this broken world, scavenging for survival, preyed upon by bandits and mutants and worse things that emerge from the irradiated wastelands when night falls. Disease is rampant. Mutation is common, the result of generations of exposure to radiation, chemical weapons, and the subtler corruption of the warp. Psychers continue to appear with alarming frequency, and their uncontrolled powers bring terror and destruction wherever they manifest. Demonic possession is a known and feared phenomenon, and in the cult-like religions that have sprung up in the absence of any coherent scientific understanding of the warp, are as dangerous as the threats they claim to protect against. This is the world. This is what humanity's homeworld has become. This is Old Night. And it is not just the physical landscape that has been devastated. The cultural and intellectual heritage of human civilization has been almost entirely destroyed. The libraries that once contained the accumulated knowledge of millennia are ashes. The universities and research institutions that drove the scientific advances of the Golden Age are rubble. The communication networks that once connected billions of minds across the planet and across the stars are dead, their infrastructure smashed or cannibalized for parts. Each generation knows less than the one that came before it, as a cascading failure of knowledge that has reduced humanity on its own homeworld to a state barely above savagery. The techno-barbarian warlords may wield weapons of extraordinary power, but they wield them the way a child might swing a hammer, with force, but without understanding. This is not a world that can be saved by diplomacy alone. This is not a world that can be united by speeches or treaties or appeals to shared heritage. The warlords of old Earth are not rational actors operating within a framework of international relations. They are predators, apex survivors of a 5,000-year-long competition that has systematically selected for the most ruthless, the most violent, and the most paranoid. They will not lay down their weapons because someone asks nicely. They will not share their territory because it is the right thing to do. They will not cooperate for the greater good because the very concept of a greater good has been burned out of them by generations of unrelenting warfare. To unite this world, you would need something more than charisma or vision. You would need overwhelming force. You would need warriors who could go where no ordinary soldier could survive, and do what no ordinary army could accomplish. You would need beings who were more than human, weapons that could break the back of any opposition and crush any resistance. You would need the Thunder Warriors. But what you would also need, and this is a point that often gets lost in the broader discussion, is the mind behind the Thunder Warriors. The genius that conceived of them, the vision that directed their creation, and the cold, calculating intelligence that understood exactly what was needed and was willing to do whatever it took to get it. Because the Thunder Warriors did not simply appear out of nowhere. They were the product of a mind that had been planning for this moment for longer than most civilizations had existed. A mind that could see not just the immediate need for a conquering army, but the entire arc of human history stretching out before it, like a road through the darkness. The Emperor understood something that none of the techno-barbarian warlords could grasp, that the wars of old Earth were not just local conflicts, but symptoms of a much larger crisis. Humanity was not merely fighting itself. It was fighting for its very survival as a species, threatened by warp-spawned entities, predatory alien races, or as in the consequences of its own technological hubris. The unification of terror was not an end in itself, but a necessary first step toward a much grander goal, the creation of a galaxy-spanning civilization that could protect the human race against all threats, both external and internal. To achieve this goal, the Emperor needed to move quickly. The warp storms that had isolated Terra were beginning to calm, and the window of opportunity they presented would not last forever. If he could unite Terra and secure the Sol system before the storms returned, or before some other catastrophe befell the human species, he would have a base of operations from which to launch his great crusade. But every day that the unification wars dragged on was a day lost, a day in which the window might close and humanity's last, in best chance at survival, might be lost forever. This urgency shaped every aspect of the Thunder Warriors' creation. They were not designed with long-term sustainability in mind, because there was no time for long-term planning. They were designed to be as powerful as possible, as quickly as possible, to overwhelm any opposition and unite the planet in the shortest possible time. If that meant cutting corners on genetic stability, if that meant accepting a higher rate of metabolic failure and mental instability, if that meant creating warriors who would burn bright and then burn out, then so be it. The calculus was simple and brutal. Better to have an army of unstable super soldiers now than a perfect army that would not be ready for another century. This perspective does not excuse the Emperor's later treatment of the Thunder Warriors. But it does provide context. The Emperor was not creating the Thunder Warriors out of cruelty or indifference. He was creating them out of desperation. The desperation of a being who could see the abyss yawning before the human species and knew that the only way to prevent humanity from falling into it was to act immediately, with whatever tools were available, regardless of the long-term consequences. The Thunder Warriors were the product of that desperation, and their flaws were the price of their power. It is worth pausing here to consider the human cost of the augmentation process itself. We have discussed the technical details of how the Thunder Warriors were created, the genetic sculpting and the muscle grafting and the alchemical augmentation. But what we have not discussed is what it felt like. What it was like to lie on a slab in a laboratory beneath the Himalayan mountains and have your body taken apart and rebuilt, cell by cell, organ by organ, bone by bone. What it was like to feel your muscles tearing and regrowing, your skeleton cracking and reforming, your very DNA being rewritten while you were still conscious, still aware, still screaming. The records are fragmentary, but what little survives suggests that the process was agonizing beyond description. The subjects were not sedated, or if they were, the sedation was inadequate to suppress the pain of having their fundamental biology rewritten. Some died during the process, their bodies unable to withstand the trauma of the transformation. Others survived, but were left permanently altered in ways that went beyond the physical, haunted by the memory of the pain, yet driven by a rage that was partly the result of their genetic modifications, and partly the legacy of what had been done to them. And yet they endured. They endured because they believed in what the Emperor was building, believed that the suffering was worth it if it meant a better future for humanity. They endured because they were the kind of men who had already been willing to follow the Emperor into battle against impossible odds, the kind of men who had looked at the broken, dying world around them and decided that they would rather fight for something better than accept the status quo. They were volunteers, and that makes their story both more heroic and more tragic, because they chose this fate. They chose the pain and the power and the abbreviated lifespan, not knowing the full extent of what they were choosing, not understanding the price they would ultimately pay, but choosing nonetheless. Among the most powerful of these techno-barbarian states was the kingdom of Ursh, a sprawling empire that covered the vast steppes of what had once been Russia and Central Asia. Ursh was ruled by the despot Caligan, a warlord of cruel character who commanded vast armies of techno-barbarian warriors. Ursh was the mightiest of the techno-barbarian empires, and its armies were feared across the continent, but it was not the most technologically advanced. That distinction belonged to other powers, such as the Nordafric conclaves, whose superior military machines Caligan coveted and whose conquest he frequently plotted. To the east sprawled the Pan-Pacific Empire, ruled by the infamous Nathan Doom, described in the fragments of historical records that survive as the half-mad, half-genius. Doom was perhaps the most dangerous of the techno-barbarian warlords, a man whose intellect was matched only by his cruelty, and whose ambitions encompassed not merely the conquest of a continent, but the domination of the entire world. His empire was vast, his armies powerful, and his willingness to use the most terrible weapons of mass destruction in his arsenal made him a threat that even the other great warlords were cautious about provoking. There was Cardinal Tang of the Indonesic bloc, who ruled a theocratic empire in what had been Southeast Asia, his power built on a foundation of religious fervor and the ruthless suppression of dissent. There were the Nordafrique conclaves, or repositories of advanced military technology that made them targets for conquest by their less sophisticated neighbors. There was the Terawatt clan, technologists who would eventually ally themselves with the rising power that would unite the world. There were the warlords of Albia, proud and fierce, who had maintained something approaching an organized military tradition, even through the darkest days of Old Night. And scattered across the surface of the ruined world were dozens of other kingdoms, empires, city-states, and nomadic tribes, all of them locked in an endless cycle of war, conquest, and destruction. Terra was a dying world, and the species that had been born upon it was dying with it. Humanity was eating itself alive, and there was no one, anywhere, who seemed capable of stopping it. This was the world into which the Emperor stepped, and this was the world that would give birth to the Thunder Warriors. Now let us talk about the Emperor himself for a moment, because you cannot understand the Thunder Warriors without first understanding the being who created them. The Emperor of mankind is perhaps the most enigmatic figure in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting, a being whose true nature, origins, and motivations remain subjects of fierce debate among scholars, historians, and fans alike. What we know, or what we think we know, is this. The Emperor was a perpetual, an immortal being who had walked the earth since the earliest days of human civilization, living countless lives under countless names, guiding humanity from the shadows for tens of thousands of years. He was the most powerful psyker in human history, or possessed of abilities that bordered on the godlike, and he was also perhaps the single most brilliant scientific mind ever to exist. He was a warrior, a scientist, a diplomat, a philosopher, and a strategist without equal. For millennia, the Emperor had chosen to remain hidden, working behind the scenes to guide humanity's development without revealing his existence to the wider world. He had watched the rise of human civilization during the age of technology, and he had watched its collapse during the age of strife. He had seen the emergence of psychers, the rebellion of the Men of Iron, and the descent of terror into barbarism. And through all of this, he had been planning, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself and take direct control of humanity's destiny. The Emperor's patience was not infinite, however, and neither was his detachment. The things he witnessed during the age of strife, the wars and the famines and the cannibalism, and the slow, grinding descent into darkness, affected him in ways that are difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. He was watching his species destroy itself, watching the potential of billions squandered in pointless conflicts over scraps of territory on a dying world. Every day that passed brought humanity closer to extinction, and every delay in his plans meant more lives lost, more knowledge destroyed, more potential wasted. There is a theory, not widely supported, but impossible to entirely dismiss, that the Emperor's decision to create the Thunder Warriors was driven not just by strategic calculation, but by something approaching desperation. He had spent millennia watching humanity suffer, and when he finally decided to act, he chose the fastest, most direct path to his goal, even though he knew that path involved compromises that would have terrible consequences. The Thunder Warriors were the product of haste, of urgency, of a mind that was tired of watching and waiting and ready to act, regardless of the cost. This would explain a great deal about the Thunder Warriors and their flaws. A more patient creator might have taken the time to perfect the augmentation process, to work out the genetic instabilities before deploying his creations in battle. But the Emperor did not have the luxury of time, or so he believed. Every year he spent perfecting the Thunder Warriors was a year in which the warlords of terror continued to make war upon each other, a year in which humanity's chances of survival grew slimmer. A year in which the window of opportunity he had been waiting for might close forever. And so he chose speed over perfection, power over stability, immediate results over long-term viability. It was a choice that would have consequences far beyond what even the Emperor could have predicted. That moment came in the late 29th millennium, when the warp storms that had isolated Terra for thousands of years finally began to calm. The Emperor saw a window of opportunity, a chance to unite the fractured world beneath his rule before the storms returned, or some even greater catastrophe befell the human species. But to do this, he needed more than his own formidable abilities. He needed an army, not just any army, but a force so overwhelming, so utterly dominant, that no warlord on Terra would be able to stand against it. And he needed warriors who were more than human, soldiers who could go where no ordinary fighter could survive and do what no ordinary soldier could accomplish. And so, in the secret laboratories hidden beneath what had once been the Himalayan mountains, the Emperor began the work that would produce the Thunder Warriors. Now, imagine the scale of what was being attempted here. The Emperor was not simply training better soldiers or equipping an army with superior weapons, although he would do both of those things as well. He was attempting something far more radical, far more ambitious, and far more dangerous. He was rewriting the human genetic code itself, or reaching into the fundamental building blocks of biology and reshaping them to create something that had never existed before, a human being engineered from the cellular level upward to be the ultimate weapon of war. The creation of the Thunder Warriors was accomplished through a combination of techniques that the sources describe as alchemical augmentation, somatic gene sculpting, and muscle grafting. These terms encompass a range of procedures so radical that they verge on the miraculous, even by the standards of a setting where genetic engineering has been practiced for millennia. The Emperor drew upon the accumulated genetic knowledge of the age of technology, the hard-won wisdom of the age of strife, and his own unparalleled genius in the field of bioalchemy to develop a process that could transform an ordinary adult male human into something categorically different, something superhuman. The subjects who underwent this process were adult male supporters of the Emperor, volunteers who believed in his vision of a united humanity and were willing to endure unimaginable suffering for the chance to serve that vision. This is an important distinction from the later Space Marines, who would be created from adolescent boys whose bodies were still growing and were therefore more receptive to the implantation of specialized organs. The Thunder Warriors were made from men who had already reached physical maturity, which made the transformation process both more brutal and less refined than the later Astartes procedures. Yet the details of what was done to these men are fragmentary and uncertain, obscured by the passage of millennia and the deliberate suppression of records by imperial authorities. But we can piece together enough to form a picture that is as awe-inspiring as it is horrifying. The subjects were essentially taken apart and rebuilt at the genetic level. Their muscles were enhanced and supplemented through grafting techniques that increased their strength, speed, and endurance far beyond what any natural human body could achieve. Their bones were thickened and reinforced to support the massive musculature that had been added to their frames. Their metabolisms were altered to process nutrients with superhuman efficiency, feeding the enormous energy requirements of their enhanced bodies. Their immune systems were boosted to resist diseases, toxins, and even the corrupting influence of chaos. Their reflexes were sharpened to levels that bordered on the precognitive. Their pain tolerance was raised to a point where injuries that would incapacitate or kill a normal human could be fought through and ignored. What is particularly noteworthy, and what hints at the darker aspects of the Thunder Warriors' creation, is that this process appears to have involved not just conventional genetic engineering, but something more esoteric, something that may have touched upon the warp itself. The Thunder Warriors were created to be highly resistant to psychic attacks, a quality that would prove invaluable in a world where sorcery was a common weapon among the techno-barbarian warlords. That this resistance was so pronounced that any psyker who attempted a mental assault on a Thunder Warrior would experience severe pain as a result, as if the warrior's mind were somehow toxic to psychic intrusion. This suggests that the Emperor may have woven some form of psychic protection into the very genetic fabric of the Thunder Warriors, a touch of the warp in their creation that would have profound and troubling implications. There is also evidence, particularly from the war against the Confederacy of Morlan Sen, one of the earliest conquests of the Unification Wars, that the Thunder Warriors could be driven into a berserker frenzy when exposed to warp energy. During that campaign, exposure to sorcery caused the Thunder Warriors to lose control completely, butchering everyone in their path. Including non-combatants and individuals the Emperor would have preferred to capture alive. The sheer carnage that resulted from this incident was the first serious cause for concern among the Imperial command about the long-term viability of the Thunder Warriors as a fighting force. This dual relationship with the warp, resistant to its direct attacks, yet dangerously susceptible to its influence in terms of self-control, points to the experimental and inherently unstable nature of the Thunder Warriors' creation. They were a first attempt, a prototype, forged in haste and desperation by a being who was, for all his godlike power, still working with incomplete knowledge and limited resources. The Emperor needed weapons that could win the war for Terra, and he needed them quickly. The Thunder Warriors were the answer to that need. They are brutally effective, but fundamentally flawed, designed to accomplish a specific task rather than to endure for the ages. The woman who is credited in some sources as having led much of the actual genetic work behind the Thunder Warriors is Amma Astarte, described as one of the most talented geneticists in all of human history. Astarte, along with the Emperor and a team of savants and gene wrights, some willing volunteers, and others taken as captives from conquered warlords, worked in the secret laboratories beneath the Himalayas to develop and refine the augmentation process. The connection between Astarte and the later Space Marines, who bear the formal designation of Legiones Astartes, is obvious and intentional. She would go on to play a crucial role in the development of the Astartes project that would eventually replace the Thunder Warriors, though her story would end in betrayal and tragedy. The result of all this work was a being of extraordinary physical power. A fully augmented Thunder Warrior was massive, standing taller and broader than even most later Space Marines. Their upper body strength was described as unparalleled, so immense that their enhanced arms and torso could crush through armor, shatter bone, and tear apart opponents with an ease that bordered on the casual. Their legs, while not augmented to the same degree as their upper bodies in the earliest iterations, still possessed strength that was staggering by any standard. As even a Thunder Warrior in the advanced stages of physical deterioration could kick completely through the torso of a normal human being. Their bones were thicker than those of the later Astartes, so dense and hard that a Thunder Warrior could shatter the skull of a Space Marine with a single headbutt. Their reflexes were enhanced to a point where a Thunder Warrior could dodge the shot of a plasma gun, while already engaged in fighting multiple opponents simultaneously. In short, the Thunder Warriors were monsters, beautiful, terrible, awe-inspiring monsters, created for a single purpose, to conquer a world. And that is exactly what they did. Let us linger on this for a moment, because the sheer physical dominance of the Thunder Warriors deserves to be fully appreciated. Why, think about what it means to be able to shatter the skull of an Astartes with a headbutt. Space Marines are themselves superhuman, their bones reinforced with ceramite-laced material, their skulls thickened and hardened far beyond what any normal human could achieve. And a Thunder Warrior could crack one open with his forehead, like an egg against a countertop. Think about what it means to dodge a plasma gunshot while already fighting two other opponents simultaneously. A plasma gun fires a bolt of superheated matter that travels at speeds that make conventional projectiles look sluggish. To dodge such a shot requires reaction times that are measured in fractions of milliseconds, the kind of speed that blurs the line between physical reflexes and something approaching precognition. And think about what it means for a deteriorating, declining Thunder Warrior, one whose body is actively breaking down, whose muscles are wasting, and whose organs are failing, to still be capable of kicking completely through the torso of a normal human being, not punching through, not cutting through with a weapon, kicking through, with a leg that is, by the standards of the Thunder Warrior's prime, significantly weakened by the ravages of genetic instability. Imagine what that same warrior could have done at the peak of his power, before the deterioration set in. Imagine what the Thunder Warriors were like when they were young and whole, and burning with the full fire of their augmented physiology. The Thunder Warriors in their prime were not simply strong. They were forces of nature wrapped in flesh and metal. When they charged, the ground shook. When they struck, our bones shattered and armor crumpled like parchment. When they fought in close quarters, which was their preferred method of combat, the result was less a battle and more a natural disaster with a target. They moved through enemy formations the way an avalanche moves through a village, with an unstoppable momentum that left nothing standing in its wake. Their combat style reflected their nature, where the later Space Marines would fight with the precision and discipline of soldiers, coordinating their movements, covering each other's advances, and operating within carefully defined tactical frameworks. The Thunder Warriors fought more like, well, warriors. Individual, ferocious, driven by instinct and aggression, as much as by training and tactical awareness. They were compared to lions, solitary predators of immense individual power, while the Astartes were compared to wolves, pack hunters whose strength lay in coordination and teamwork. Both approaches were effective, but they were fundamentally different in philosophy and execution. This individualistic fighting style was both the Thunder Warriors' greatest strength and one of their most significant weaknesses. In close quarters combat, where individual power and aggression mattered most, the Thunder Warriors were virtually unmatched. But in larger, more complex tactical situations, where coordination and discipline were essential, the Thunder Warriors' tendency toward individual action could become a liability. They were magnificent warriors, but imperfect soldiers, and that distinction would ultimately prove to be one of the factors that sealed their fate. But before we get to the conquering, let us talk about what these warriors wore and how they were organized, because the details paint a vivid picture of a fighting force that was as crude and magnificent as the age that produced it. First, though, a word about the Thunder Warriors as people, because this is something that often gets overlooked in discussions that focus on their combat capabilities and their tragic fate. The Thunder Warriors were not machines. They were not automata. They were men, human men, who had been transformed into something extraordinary and then forced to cope with the consequences of that transformation. Unlike the later Astartes, who underwent extensive psychological conditioning alongside their physical transformation, the Thunder Warriors retained the full spectrum of human emotion. They could love, they could hate, and they could feel joy and sorrow and fear and hope. They could form bonds of friendship and brotherhood that were as deep and intense as anything an unaugmented human could experience. Deeper, in fact, because the shared trauma of their transformation and the constant proximity of death created connections between Thunder Warriors that went beyond anything that ordinary human relationships could produce. This emotional richness was both the Thunder Warriors' greatest strength and their most profound vulnerability. In battle, it made them terrifying. They did not fight with the cold precision of machines or the trained discipline of soldiers. They fought with passion, with fury, with a white-hot emotional intensity that drove them to feats of valor and violence that no amount of training or conditioning could replicate. A Thunder Warrior defending a fallen brother would fight with a fury that transcended anything mere programming could produce. A Thunder Warrior, avenging a perceived wrong, would pursue his vengeance with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. But outside of battle, those same emotions could be devastating. Thunder Warriors grieved for fallen comrades with an intensity that could be debilitating. They formed attachments to mortal humans, to the people of the territories they had conquered, and the civilians they were supposed to be protecting. And when those people died, as they inevitably did, the Thunder Warriors felt their loss acutely. Some Thunder Warriors developed relationships with the mortal soldiers who fought alongside them, bonds of mentorship and camaraderie that were complicated by the enormous physical and physiological gulf that separated them. When those mortal soldiers aged and died, The Thunder Warriors who had cared for them experienced a kind of grief that was unique to beings whose enhanced lifespans meant they outlived their unaugmented companions by decades. There are fragmentary accounts of Thunder Warriors who simply stopped functioning after the death of a particularly close companion, not because of any physical malfunction, but because their grief overwhelmed their ability to continue. Others channeled their grief into rage, becoming more violent and more aggressive with each loss, until they were barely controllable even by the standards of a force that had never been particularly controllable to begin with. Thus the Emperor and his commanders recognized the problem but had no real solution for it.
Now, I want to take a quick second here to just share something with you all. The Thunder Warriors are hands down one of my favorite pieces of lore in all of 40K, and honestly I think they're criminally underrated. Like, we spent so much time talking about the Primarchs and the Legions and the Heresy, and all of that is great, but the Thunder Warriors hit different for me. Their story has this raw, almost painful human quality to it that you just do not get anywhere else in the setting. These were not demigods, they were men, broken, rebuilt, used up, and thrown away. And the fact that some of them still fought to survive after everything that was done to them, that Tyrannus sat in a basement and literally outsmarted the Emperor's own science just to stay alive, that gets me every single time. And I think the reason I keep coming back to this topic is because it says something real about how we treat the people who sacrifice the most. But anyways, that's just my take on it. Let's get back to the video.
Because the emotional intensity that made Thunder Warriors grieve so deeply was the same quality that made them fight so ferociously. You could not remove the grief without also removing the fury, and the fury was the entire point. This emotional volatility was compounded by the fact that the Thunder Warriors were fully aware of their own mortality. Unlike the Astartes, who would be engineered to be largely indifferent to the prospect of their own death, the Thunder Warriors cared about living. They wanted to survive, not just in the abstract sense of organisms that were programmed to preserve themselves, but in the deeply personal, deeply human sense of beings who valued their own existence and feared its ending. As they had dreams and plans and hopes that extended beyond the next battle, and the knowledge that their genetic instability might cut those dreams short at any moment was a source of constant, grinding anxiety that no amount of battlefield courage could entirely suppress. Imagine living with that knowledge. Imagine waking up every morning not knowing whether this would be the day your body finally gave out, whether the muscles that had carried you through 100 battles would suddenly fail, whether the mind that had kept you alive through impossible odds would suddenly shatter into 1,000 pieces. Imagine fighting with every ounce of your strength and skill, not because you were unafraid of death, but because you were terrified of it, because every victory meant one more day of the life that was being stolen from you piece by piece. And that was what it was like to be a Thunder Warrior. And the fact that they fought as bravely and as effectively as they did, knowing what they knew, feeling what they felt, is perhaps the most remarkable thing about them. The Thunder Warriors also developed their own culture, their own traditions, their own way of making meaning out of an existence that had been imposed upon them without their consent. They composed battle songs and war chants that became part of the ritual of preparation for combat. They developed elaborate codes of honor and conduct that governed their interactions with each other and with the mortal soldiers who served alongside them. They created their own mythology, a collection of stories and legends about the greatest deeds of the greatest Thunder Warriors, and passed down from warrior to warrior through oral tradition because the Emperor had never bothered to provide them with a formal historical record. Some of these traditions survived the cull, carried forward by the scattered survivors who refused to let the memory of their kind die out entirely. Others were lost forever, destroyed along with the warriors who had created them, their songs unsung and their stories untold. The loss of this cultural heritage is one of the lesser discussed tragedies of the Thunder Warriors story, but it is a tragedy nonetheless. A people's culture is its soul, and when the Thunder Warriors were destroyed, their culture was destroyed with them, leaving behind only fragments and echoes that give us the barest glimpse of what had once been a vibrant, distinctive, and deeply human way of life. Now, yet with that context in mind, let us talk about the equipment and the organization. The armor worn by the Thunder Warriors was the Mark I power armor, commonly known as Thunder Armor, though that name was applied retroactively, long after the Unification Wars were over. At the time, it was simply called Power Armor, because there was nothing else to compare it to. It was the first of its kind in the Emperor's service, and it set a precedent that would echo down through 10,000 years of Imperial history. Thunder Armor was not what you would think of if someone said the words Space Marine Power Armor today. It was not a fully enclosed environmental suit with integrated life support, sealed against vacuum and equipped with the sophisticated sensor arrays and communication systems that later Marks would feature. No. Our Thunder Armor was a product of its time, a time when warfare was fought exclusively on the surface of a single planet, in atmosphere, against enemies who were right there in front of you, close enough to touch, close enough to kill with your bare hands if your weapon failed. It was designed for one thing: close quarters dominance. The main component of the armor was a massive powered torso piece that enclosed the chest and arms of the wearer. Beneath the armor plating, coiled energy cables transmitted power from a back-mounted power pack to the arms, greatly increasing the already superhuman strength of the Thunder Warrior by a factor of 3 to 4 times. Since the fighting on Terra during this period was primarily close quarters, the strength of a warrior's chest and arms was of paramount importance. The armor was designed to make the already strongest warriors on the planet into something approaching forces of nature in melee combat. The legs, by contrast, were typically not power armored at all in the earliest versions. They were enclosed in tough padded breeches, with the best equipped warriors sometimes wearing armored greaves and boots. This was a deliberate design choice, reflecting the priorities of the age. Upper body strength was what won battles in the ruined cities and cramped tunnels of old Earth, and that was what the armor was designed to enhance. Later iterations of Thunder Armor would improve the leg protection, but the fundamental design philosophy remained the same: massive upper body power, delivered through a suit of armor that was as much a weapon in itself as the guns and blades its wearer carried. The power supply for the armor was contained in a notably bulky back-mounted unit, most of which was taken up by cooling systems designed to prevent the entire armor from overheating during sustained operation. This backpack design, crude as it was, established a pattern that would be incorporated into every subsequent mark of Space Marine power armor for the next 10,000 years. In that sense, every Space Marine who has ever marched to war carries with him a direct technological lineage back to the Thunder Warriors and their Mark I Thunder Armor. The noise that Thunder Armor produced in operation is another detail worth lingering on, because it tells us something about the visceral, immediate experience of encountering a Thunder Warrior in combat. Later marks of power armor were designed with stealth capabilities and sound dampening systems and streamlined power distribution that made them relatively quiet in operation. Thunder Armor had none of this. It was loud. The power systems hummed and whined. The energy cables crackled as they transmitted power from the backpack to the arms. The servos that assisted the wearer's movements ground and hissed with every step and every swing. The cooling systems roared as they struggled to dissipate the enormous heat generated by the armor's operation. When a squad of Thunder Warriors advanced on an enemy position, the sound preceded them like a herald. The grinding of gears, the hissing of hydraulics, the low bass rumble of power generators working at full capacity. Then came the visual: hulking figures emerging from the smoke and dust of the battlefield, their massive torsos encased in metal plate, whilst the Raptor Imperialis blazing on their chests, their eyes burning with the kind of focused intensity that only the gene-enhanced could produce. And then came the impact, the point at which sound and vision and physical reality all merged into a single, overwhelming experience of violence and destruction. For the techno-barbarian soldiers who faced the Thunder Warriors on the battlefield, the experience must have been something beyond terror. These were not merely larger, better-armed opponents. They were something fundamentally different, something that did not belong in the same category as ordinary human soldiers. Fighting a Thunder Warrior was not like fighting a better-equipped enemy. It was like fighting a natural disaster, a force of nature that could not be reasoned with, could not be bargained with, and could not be stopped by anything less than overwhelming force or pure luck. Many techno-barbarian warlords, hearing reports of the Thunder Warriors' capabilities, simply surrendered rather than face them in battle, and those who chose to fight often found that their most elite troops, warriors who had been the terror of their enemies for years or decades, were brushed aside with almost contemptuous ease. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. The Thunder Warriors did not just defeat armies. They broke the will of entire civilizations, demonstrating with brutal clarity that the old order was finished and that a new power had risen that could not be challenged or resisted. This psychological dimension of the Thunder Warriors' effectiveness is often overlooked in discussions of their combat capabilities, but it was arguably just as important as their physical prowess. An army that breaks and runs before the battle is properly joined is an army that does not need to be fought, and the Thunder Warriors' fearsome reputation ensured that many potential battles never materialized. The Emperor understood this, which is why he allowed and even encouraged the spread of stories about the Thunder Warriors' invincibility. Every warlord who surrendered without a fight was a campaign that did not need to be fought, a stockpile of resources that did not need to be expended, a block of time that could be devoted to other objectives. In this sense, the Thunder Warriors were not just weapons, but symbols. They were the physical embodiment of the Emperor's power and his determination to unite the world, regardless of the cost. That their very existence was a statement, a declaration that the age of the techno-barbarians was over and that a new era was beginning, an era in which humanity would be united under a single ruler and directed toward a single purpose. The Thunder Warriors were the vanguard of that new era, the first rays of a dawn that would eventually illuminate the entire galaxy. Each suit of Thunder armor was produced locally, meaning that individual suits varied heavily in their exact design and appearance. There was no standardized manufacturing process, no assembly line producing identical suits for identical warriors. Each suit was essentially handcrafted, a work of brutal artisanship that reflected the resources and preferences of the individual warrior who wore it. Some suits were relatively plain, functional pieces of war equipment and nothing more. Others were ornate and flamboyant, decorated with elaborate designs and personal heraldry that spoke to the individual warrior's achievements and status. What was universal, however, was the symbol displayed on the breastplate, the Raptor Imperialis, the thunderbolt and raptor's head emblem that was the Emperor's personal symbol in those early days, long before the double-headed imperial aquila that would become the standard icon of the Imperium of man. This symbol, prominently displayed on the chest of every Thunder Warrior, was the source of the name Thunder Armor, and, by extension, the name Thunder Warriors themselves. It was a mark of allegiance, a declaration that the wearer served the will of the being who would one day be called the Emperor of mankind, and it was a promise of violence and a warning to all who stood against the nascent Imperium. The weapons the Thunder Warriors carried were similarly a product of their age. In the earliest days, they wielded las rifles and wore metal armor with leather strappings, equipment that, while superior to what most techno-barbarian warlords could field, was still relatively primitive compared to what would come later. As the Unification Wars progressed and the Emperor's territories expanded, the weaponry available to the Thunder Warriors improved. They gained access to bolters, chainswords, power weapons, and other armaments that would become standard equipment for the later Space Marines. But the Thunder Warriors' greatest weapons were always their own bodies, their incredible strength, their devastating speed, their ability to rip and tear through enemy formations with a fury that was as much instinct as training. The organizational structure of the Thunder Warriors mirrored what would later become the standard for the Space Marine legions, and this was almost certainly deliberate. They were organized into 20 large units known as legions, each one focused on a particular tactical or strategic specialty. The 4th Legion, for example, was known as the Iron Lords and specialized in siege warfare, a direct foreshadowing of the later Fourth Legion of the Legion's Astartes, the Iron Warriors, who would fill an identical role during the Great Crusade. This parallel structure suggests that the Emperor was already thinking about the future, already planning the force that would replace the Thunder Warriors, even as he was creating them. Each Thunder Warrior Legion was commanded by a warrior who held the rank of Primarch. Now, this is a word that carries enormous weight in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, and it is important to understand that the Thunder Warrior Primarchs were fundamentally different from the later Primarchs of the Space Marine Legions. The Space Marine Primarchs were demigods, genetically engineered sons of the Emperor himself, each one unique and impossibly powerful, living embodiments of different aspects of the Emperor's own nature. The Thunder Warrior Primarchs were nothing so grand. They were simply the best warriors and tacticians among the Thunder Warriors, superlative soldiers who had been promoted to positions of command based on their skill in battle and their ability to lead their fellow warriors. Thus, they were not genetically different from the warriors they commanded, not physically or mentally superior in any fundamental way. They were first among equals, chosen for excellence rather than created for supremacy. One of these Primarchs, whose name has survived the passage of 10,000 years, was Ushotan, commander of the Fourth Legion, the Iron Lords. Ushotan would play a significant role in the final chapter of the Thunder Warriors' story, but that is a tale for later. For now, it is enough to know that he was regarded as a warrior of exceptional ability and a leader whose loyalty to the Emperor was, for a time at least, beyond question. The total number of Thunder Warriors is a matter of some historical uncertainty, but the available sources suggest that each legion consisted of no more than a few hundred warriors at most. So this would put the total strength of the 20 Thunder Warrior legions at somewhere in the range of a few thousand warriors total. A tiny force by the standards of the Imperium that would come later, but utterly devastating in the context of old Earth's fragmented and technologically degraded armies. A few thousand genetically enhanced super soldiers, each one worth dozens or even hundreds of ordinary fighters, was more than enough to tip the balance of power on a world that had been locked in stalemate for millennia. And tip the balance they did. Oh, how they tipped it. The Unification Wars began in earnest in the late 29th millennium, when the Emperor emerged from his fortress in the Himalayan mountains and made his bid for the control of Terra. The wars would last for well over a century, then stretching from approximately the late 29th millennium to around 712 of the 30th millennium, a span of warfare that consumed generations of human lives and reshaped the entire surface of the planet. These were not small conflicts. These were full-scale continental wars involving millions of combatants, wars that lasted weeks at a stretch, with body counts so high that they sundered mountains and split entire continents. The sheer scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible, even by the grim standards of old Earth's eternal warfare. His forces consisted of the Thunder Warriors, the earliest members of what would become the Legio Custodes, his personal bodyguard of even more supremely augmented warriors, and a variety of mortal forces, including units that would eventually evolve into the Imperial Army. The Custodian Guard, while smaller in number than the Thunder Warriors, were individually far more powerful, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering compared to the Thunder Warriors' mass-produced brutality. But the Custodes were too few and too precious to be deployed as a conventional army. Their role was to protect the Emperor himself, to serve as his personal guard and his most trusted agents. The heavy lifting of the Unification Wars, the grinding campaigns of conquest that would consume decades and cost millions of lives, that was the work of the Thunder Warriors. The Emperor also secured an early alliance with the Terrawat clan, technologists whose advanced weapons gave his forces a significant advantage over many of the techno-barbarian states. This alliance provided the Thunder Warriors with better equipment as the wars progressed, but the core of the Emperor's military strategy was always the same. Unleash the Thunder Warriors and let their overwhelming physical superiority break the back of whatever opposition stood in the way. The reputation of the Thunder Warriors preceded them like the sound of approaching thunder before a storm. In many cases, the mere threat of their arrival was enough to convince a warlord to surrender without a fight. Those who had heard the stories, the accounts of entire armies shattered in hours, of fortifications reduced to rubble by warriors who seemed more like natural disasters than soldiers, of warlords whose bodyguards died without landing a single blow. Those who had heard such stories and believed them often chose to bend the knee rather than face the storm. And those who refused to believe, or who chose to fight regardless, and quickly discovered that the stories had not been exaggerated. The early campaigns of the Unification Wars were a series of stunning victories for the Emperor's forces, each one demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of the Thunder Warriors in a way that sent shockwaves across the planet. The Emperor swept outward from his Himalayan stronghold, conquering territory at a rate that would have been impossible for any conventional army. His Thunder Warriors smashing through defensive lines, storming fortified positions, and crushing opposing forces with a combination of superhuman strength, fearless aggression, and tactical skill that no techno-barbarian army could match. One of the early and significant campaigns was the war against the Confederacy of Morland Sen, a techno-barbarian state that possessed formidable military forces and wielded dangerous weapons from the dark age of technology. The Confederacy also employed enslaved psykers, adding a supernatural dimension to their military capabilities that made them an especially challenging opponent. The Ethnarchy, too, commanded forces that included the genetically modified warriors known as the Cassis, a reminder that the Emperor was not the only being on old Earth who had experimented with genetic enhancement. The warlords of the Age of Strife had created their own breeds of enhanced warriors, their own gene-crafted soldiers and cybernetically augmented troops, and some of these were formidable opponents, though none could match the Emperor's Thunder Warriors for raw power and ferocity. Yes, it was during the Morland Sen campaign that the Thunder Warriors first encountered warp energy on the battlefield, and the results were deeply troubling. Let me paint this scene for you, because it is one of the most disturbing episodes in the Thunder Warriors' history, and one that foreshadowed much of what would come later. Imagine a battlefield somewhere on the scarred surface of old Earth. The Thunder Warriors are advancing, as they always advance, with overwhelming force and unstoppable momentum. The soldiers of the Confederacy are falling back, their conventional forces no match for the Emperor's gene-crafted warriors. But then, the Confederacy's psykers are deployed, unleashing waves of psychic energy that wash across the battlefield like an invisible tide. The energy is corrupted, tainted with the touch of the warp. Yes, and when it hits the Thunder Warriors, something terrible happens. Instead of being harmed by the psychic assault, the Thunder Warriors are energized by it. The warp energy feeds into their enhanced physiology, like fuel into an engine, amplifying their already staggering strength and speed to levels that are almost beyond comprehension. But the cost of this amplification is control. The Thunder Warriors' minds are overwhelmed by a surge of primal aggression that obliterates their ability to distinguish between friend and foe, combatant and civilian, target and bystander. They become living weapons without safeties, berserkers of such devastating power that nothing on the battlefield can stop them. The carnage that follows is indiscriminate and absolute. The Thunder Warriors tear through the Confederacy's forces with ease, but they do not stop there. They turn on everything in their path, butchering non-combatants, destroying structures that the Emperor had specifically ordered to be preserved, killing individuals whose capture had been a strategic priority. When the frenzy finally subsides, and the Thunder Warriors regain some measure of control, the aftermath is a scene of such complete devastation that even the hardened soldiers of the Emperor's conventional forces are shaken by what they see. This incident, the Morland Sen frenzy, as some historians have called it, was the first serious cause for concern in all Imperial chains of command regarding the viability of the Thunder Warriors as a long-term military asset. It demonstrated that the Thunder Warriors were not merely powerful, but potentially dangerous to their own side. That the very qualities that made them devastating in combat also made them unpredictable and uncontrollable under certain conditions. The exposure to warp energy had revealed a vulnerability in their genetic makeup, a susceptibility to psychic influence that could transform them from disciplined, if aggressive, soldiers into mindless berserkers. This may also indicate something deeply unsettling about the nature of the Thunder Warriors' creation. The fact that warp energy strengthened them rather than harming them, that it amplified their abilities rather than disrupting them, suggests that the augmentation process that created the Thunder Warriors may have involved warp-based techniques, that the Emperor had woven elements of psychic or sorcerous power into their very genetic code. And this would explain both their resistance to direct psychic attack and their susceptibility to warp-induced frenzy. Their bodies were attuned to the warp in ways that ordinary humans were not, and that attunement could be both a shield and a conduit, depending on the circumstances. If this is true, then the Thunder Warriors were, in a sense, creatures of the warp, as much as they were creatures of the material universe, and that would make the Emperor's decision to destroy them even more understandable, if no less morally troubling. Warriors who were vulnerable to warp-induced berserker frenzies could not be trusted to operate in a galaxy where the warp was an ever-present threat. They could not be deployed on campaigns where they might encounter psychic phenomena, which is to say, they could not be deployed almost anywhere in the galaxy. For the Great Crusade, they were not merely obsolete, they were a liability. Constantin Valdor, the Captain General of the Legio Custodes and one of the Emperor's most trusted servants, witnessed the savagery of the Thunder Warriors during the Battle of Morlansen. What he saw deeply concerned him and planted the first seeds of doubt about the future of the Thunder Warriors as a fighting force. The question that began to form in Valdor's mind, and perhaps in the Emperor's mind as well, was simple and devastating. What do you do with weapons that cannot be controlled once the war is over? But that question could wait. There was a world to conquer first. The kingdom of Ursh was the mightiest of the techno-barbarian empires, and its defeat was therefore one of the most significant achievements of the Unification Wars. The Chronicles of Ursh record a long and brutal conflict between the Emperor's forces and the armies of Calagan, a war that consumed years and cost untold thousands of lives on both sides. Ursh was not an easy target. Calagan had built his empire through cunning and cruelty, and he was not the sort of despot who crumbled at the first sign of a serious challenge. When the Emperor's armies, led by the Thunder Warriors, marched into Urshite territory, Calagan responded with a strategy of defense in depth, withdrawing his forces into the vast interior of his domain and forcing the Emperor's armies to advance through terrain that had been deliberately devastated and depopulated. Entire cities were razed before the Thunder Warriors could reach them. Rivers were poisoned, crops were burned. The civilian population was either conscripted into the Urshite army or simply massacred, denied to the Emperor as a resource or a source of recruits. The Thunder Warriors advanced through this wasteland with grim determination, grinding their way through Calagan's defenses mile by mile, battle by battle. The fighting was savage and unrelenting, the Urshite soldiers fighting with the fanaticism of men who knew that surrender meant death at the hands of a despot who tolerated no disloyalty. The Thunder Warriors killed them in their thousands, their tens of thousands, each engagement adding to the already staggering body count of the Unification Wars. But for every position they overran, there was another one behind it, and for every Urshite army they destroyed, Calagan raised another from the seemingly inexhaustible population of his vast empire. The Ninth Battle of Zoza, fought against Ursh in approximately 992 of the 29th millennium, was particularly notable. During this battle, in the Nord-Afric conclaves, inexplicable ephemeral phenomena of psychic origin were encountered, supernatural events that spoke to the growing influence of the warp on the conflicts of old Earth. Soldiers on both sides reported seeing ghostly figures on the battlefield, hearing voices that whispered of things that should not be named, and experiencing moments of paralyzing terror that had no rational explanation. Some Urshite warriors were found dead without any visible injuries, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute horror that suggested they had been killed by something far worse than any physical weapon. Yet these incidents gave credence to the persistent rumors that Callaghan had made pacts with entities from the warp, that he had access to sorcerous powers that gave him abilities beyond the natural. Whether this was true or merely the result of uncontrolled psychic phenomena in an age when psychers were becoming increasingly common is a matter of debate. But the Thunder Warriors, who fought against Ursh, reported encountering phenomena on the battlefield that could not be easily explained by conventional science. Some of these phenomena affected the Thunder Warriors themselves in unexpected ways, heightening their already formidable aggression and pushing them toward the kind of berserker frenzy that had been observed during the campaign against the Confederacy of Morlan-Senna. It was during this campaign that Callaghan, the techno-barbarian warlord of Ursh, was finally slain, and the kingdom of Ursh was brought to heel by the Emperor's forces. The exact circumstances of Callaghan's death are disputed. Some accounts suggest he was killed by the Emperor in personal combat, a duel between two beings of extraordinary power that leveled entire buildings and left craters in the earth. Other versions indicate that Callaghan was brought down by a combined assault of Thunder Warriors who overwhelmed his bodyguard and cut him apart in a frenzy of violence that left nothing recognizable behind. Still other accounts hint that Callaghan's death was not a clean affair, that the sorcerous powers he had trafficked with did not release him easily, and that the process of killing him involved confronting things that were not entirely of the material world. Where the fall of Ursh was a turning point in the Unification Wars, removing the single most powerful opposition to the Emperor's ambitions and sending a clear message to the remaining techno-barbarian states. Resistance was futile. The Emperor's armies were coming, and nothing on Terra could stand against them. The territories of Ursh were absorbed into the nascent Imperium, their populations placed under the authority of imperial governors, their resources redirected toward the Emperor's great projects. The soldiers who had survived the war were given a choice: serve the Emperor or die. Most chose to serve. Those who did not were dealt with swiftly and without mercy. But the fall of Ursh was just one chapter in a much longer story of conquest that played out across every corner of the ravaged planet. Let me walk you through some of the other major campaigns, because each one reveals something important about the Thunder Warriors and the world they were built to conquer. The Achaemenid Empire, a techno-barbarian state in the Middle East, in the region of what had been ancient Iran, was one of the wealthier and more pragmatic of the pre-unification states. Described as being made up of wealthy tribes, the Achaemenid leadership saw the writing on the wall early and allied themselves with the Emperor's nascent Imperium quickly, avoiding the horrors of atomic war and invasion that befell their less cooperative neighbors. Their genomes, notably, were uncontaminated by the inherited flaws and viral defects that afflicted many other populations after centuries of exposure to lingering radiation and biological warfare vectors, which made them excellent candidates for recruitment into the newborn Space Marine legions that were being developed alongside the Thunder Warriors. It was a pragmatic decision on both sides, one of the rare examples of the Unification Wars being advanced through diplomacy rather than violence. Others were not so fortunate. The Indonesic bloc, Cardinal Tang's sprawling theocratic domain in what had been Southeast Asia, was a particularly difficult conquest. Tang's power was built on religious fervor and the suppression of dissent, and his followers fought with the fanatical determination of true believers. The Thunder Warriors crashed through their lines with characteristic ferocity, but the street-by-street, building-by-building nature of the fighting in the bloc's dense urban centers made it a grinding, costly affair. Our religious zealots do not break easily, and the Indonesic bloc extracted a heavy toll in blood before its resistance was finally crushed. The case of Boeotia provides an interesting counterpoint to the more straightforward campaigns of conquest. Boeotia was a relatively small state that tacitly recognized the emperor's dominance, but whose ruling monarchy, the Ysealti dynasty, used every diplomatic trick available to avoid actually surrendering their power. The emperor, in what some might see as a rare display of patience or others might see as a calculated strategy, allowed the Ysealti to carry on like this for over 150 years, hoping that they would eventually integrate themselves into the unified Imperium at their own pace. When they stubbornly refused, the Imperial army was forced to invade, and eventually even the Thousand Sons Legion of the Legiones Astartes was deployed to crush the defiant little state. The story of Boeotia illustrates the limits of the emperor's patience, his willingness to use diplomatic means when possible, but his ultimate readiness to employ force when diplomacy failed. Then there was High Brazil, whose last independent ruler, Dalmuth Kin, was one of the very last Terran warlords to be defeated by the emperor, and the Caucasus Wastes, whose ruler, the Ethnarch, was defeated and imprisoned in the infamous dungeon of Kangba Marwu, one of the most secure prison facilities on the planet, whose walls were clad in adamantium plate, and whose cells echoed with the pleas of tyrants and warlords who had dared to oppose the emperor's will. Each conquest added to the emperor's domain, but each defeat of another warlord brought the dream of unity closer to reality. The American lands, the remnants of Germany, the Nordic territories, the mysterious realm of France, the distant reaches of Oceania, one by one they fell or were brought to heel, some through force, a few through diplomacy, all through the inexorable expansion of the emperor's power. The Thunder Warriors were the common thread in all of these campaigns, the spearhead that broke through every defensive line, the hammer that shattered every fortification, the storm that swept away every army that dared to stand against the lightning. And through it all, the ordinary people of Terra watched and waited and hoped. For some, the Emperor's coming was a liberation, a release from the tyranny of warlords who had brutalized them for generations. For others, yes, it was simply the replacement of one conqueror with another, a change of masters that meant little to those who had nothing left to lose. And for some, the smallest and most vulnerable, the Emperor's conquest was just another catastrophe in a long line of catastrophes, another upheaval in a world that had known nothing but upheaval for 5,000 years. The Pan-Pacific Empire of Narthandume was another major obstacle, ruled by a tyrant whose combination of genius and madness made him one of the most dangerous opponents the Emperor faced. Dume himself was one of the most powerful psychers on old Earth, a being of such immense psychic ability that he could warp reality itself within his sphere of influence. His control over his subjects was not merely political, but psychic, as a form of mental domination that rendered his population utterly loyal and his armies fearless to the point of suicidal. Fighting against Doom's forces was unlike fighting against any other techno-barbarian army, because his soldiers did not fear pain, did not fear death, and did not break under any circumstances. They fought until they were physically destroyed, every last one of them, with no regard for self-preservation or tactical retreat. The Thunder Warriors found Doom's psychic soldiers to be among the most difficult opponents they faced during the entire Unification Wars. Not because the Pan-Pacific troops were individually strong, they were not, but because their utter fearlessness and willingness to die made the usual tactics of shock and intimidation useless against them. Of the Thunder Warriors' greatest weapon had always been the terror they inspired in their enemies, the sight of massive, armored super soldiers charging into battle with the fury of ancient gods. Against enemies who felt no fear, that weapon was blunted, and the Thunder Warriors were forced to rely on pure combat power to grind down an enemy that simply would not stop coming. The campaign against the Pan-Pacific Empire was one of the bloodiest of the Unification Wars, not because the Emperor's forces were in serious danger of losing, but because every engagement required the complete physical destruction of every enemy soldier on the field. There was no routing, no surrender, no tactical withdrawal. Every battle was a fight to the death, and the toll on both sides was appalling. The Thunder Warriors, for all their superhuman abilities, were not inexhaustible, and the constant grinding attrition of fighting an enemy that simply refused to die took its toll on their numbers and their morale. The ultimate fate of Narthandoom himself is shrouded in mystery. Some accounts say he was killed by the Emperor in personal combat, his vast psychic powers proving insufficient against the might of the Master of Mankind. Others suggest that he simply vanished when the last of his territories fell, disappearing into the depths of the ocean or the shadows of the warp, his final fate unknown. What is certain is that his empire fell, as all the empires of old Earth fell, before the inexorable advance of the Emperor's armies. The Indonesic bloc, Cardinal Tang's theocratic empire, was yet another power that the Thunder Warriors were called upon to destroy. The bloc was a theocratic state in the region of what had once been Southeast Asia, notable for its religious fervor, its advanced naval capabilities, and the fanaticism of its warrior caste. Cardinal Tang had built a society that was part military state and part religious cult, with himself as both supreme political leader and spiritual authority. His soldiers fought with the conviction of true believers, certain that death in the service of Cardinal Tang would earn them a place in whatever afterlife their religion promised. The conquest of the Indonesic bloc was accomplished through a combination of naval warfare, amphibious assault, and direct land campaigns that tested the Thunder Warriors' adaptability and endurance. The bloc's island fortresses were particularly difficult to crack, their defenders taking advantage of the natural defenses afforded by the terrain and the surrounding oceans to create positions that were nearly impregnable by conventional assault. The Thunder Warriors proved their worth in these engagements, their superhuman strength and durability allowing them to accomplish feats of combat that would have been impossible for unaugmented soldiers. Swimming through treacherous waters in partial armor, climbing sheer cliff faces under withering fire, breaching fortified positions through brute force alone. Cardinal Tang was eventually captured and executed, his theocratic state dismantled, and his territories absorbed into the growing Imperium. The Nord-Afric conclaves, with their superior military technology, were conquered and absorbed as well, yet their weapons and knowledge adding to the growing arsenal of the nascent Imperium. One by one, the great powers of old Earth were brought to their knees, their warlords killed or captured, their armies shattered, their people brought under the Emperor's rule. But not every conquest was achieved through force alone. The campaign against Albia stands as one of the most remarkable episodes of the Unification Wars, a testament to the Emperor's strategic genius and his willingness to pursue diplomatic solutions when military force alone was insufficient. The warriors of Albia were proud and fierce, and they possessed their own advanced military technology, including steam-belching proto-dreadnoughts and armored Ironside soldiers that proved surprisingly effective against the Thunder Warriors. In battle after battle, the Albians managed to hold back the Emperor's forces, though at staggering cost to their own numbers. Rather than continuing to throw his Thunder Warriors against the Albion defenses in a war of attrition that would have been costly for both sides, the Emperor took a different approach. He called a ceasefire and sought a diplomatic solution. The Emperor appeared before the Albion clan lords unarmed and clothed in white and crimson, the colors of peace and authority, and spoke to them of his vision for a united humanity. He offered them not conquest and subjugation, but partnership and purpose, glory among the stars, and redemption from the long nightmare of old night. This moment is one of the most revealing in the entire history of the Unification Wars, because it shows us a side of the Emperor that the Thunder Warriors themselves rarely saw. The Thunder Warriors knew the Emperor as a commander, a war leader, a being who pointed them at enemies and watched them destroy. But here, with the Albions, the Emperor showed himself to be something more: a diplomat, a visionary, a leader who could inspire loyalty through the power of his words as effectively as he could compel it through the strength of his armies. It is worth wondering whether things might have been different for the Thunder Warriors if the Emperor had shown them this side of himself more often, if he had treated them as partners rather than instruments, as allies rather than tools. But that is speculation, and the history speaks for itself. To the shock of many, the warlords of Albia accepted. They looked at the Emperor and saw something different from the tyrants who had dominated Terra for millennia. They saw a leader with a vision that extended beyond the next battle, the next conquest, the next season of war. They saw someone who was offering them not just survival, but a future. And so Albia became one of the most zealous supporters of unification, its warriors among the most dedicated soldiers in the Emperor's growing army. Not every holdout was treated with such patience, however. The Ethnarchy, a techno-barbarian state that commanded formidable forces, including genetically modified warriors known as the Ur-Khasis, dangerous weapons from the dark age of technology, and enslaved psychers, proved to be one of the most difficult nuts to crack. The Ethnarchy was, in many ways, the Emperor's most dangerous non-psyker opponent during the entire Unification Wars. Unlike Ursh, which relied primarily on overwhelming numbers, or the Indonesic bloc, which depended on religious fanaticism, the Ethnarchy combined all three elements of military power: superior technology, genetic enhancement, and psychic warfare. Their force fields, powered by subterranean generators that drew energy from the planet's own geothermal processes, were among the most advanced defensive systems on old Earth, capable of shrugging off weapons that would have leveled entire cities. Their Ur-Khasis warriors, while not in the same league as the Thunder Warriors, were nonetheless formidable opponents, gene-crafted soldiers whose enhanced physiology gave them advantages that ordinary techno-barbarian troops could not match. And their enslaved psychers, chained and tortured and driven to madness, were unleashed against the attacking forces with a complete disregard for the collateral damage they caused. The first attempt by Imperial forces to capture the Ethnarchy's strongholds cost the lives of an astounding 20,000 Thunder Warriors and 1 million other casualties, a staggering toll that speaks to the ferocity of the fighting and the desperation of the defenders. 20,000 Thunder Warriors. Let that number settle in your mind for a moment. These were not ordinary soldiers. Each one of those 20,000 warriors was a genetically enhanced superhuman, a being who represented an investment of time, resources, and scientific expertise that was essentially irreplaceable. Losing a single Thunder Warrior was a significant setback. Well, losing 20,000 of them in a single campaign was a catastrophe on a scale that threatened the Emperor's entire strategic plan. The battlefield must have been a vision of absolute hell. Imagine the force fields flickering and crackling as the Thunder Warriors hurled themselves against them, their weapons sparking harmlessly against barriers that were designed to resist orbital bombardment. Imagine the Ur-Khasis warriors counterattacking from behind those barriers, their own enhanced strength and speed making them dangerous opponents even for the Thunder Warriors. Imagine the enslaved psychers screaming and raving, their uncontrolled powers tearing holes in reality itself, sending bolts of pure warp energy searing across the battlefield, killing friend and foe alike with indiscriminate fury. And imagine the Thunder Warriors pushing forward through all of it, climbing over the bodies of their fallen brothers, their fury building with each step, driven by a rage that was both human and something beyond human. The first assault failed. The Thunder Warriors, for all their power, could not breach the Ethnarchy's force fields through brute force alone. They pulled back, leaving the field littered with their dead, and the air thick with the stench of blood and ozone, and the burnt metal smell of weapons that had been fired until their barrels glowed. It was one of the most devastating defeats the Thunder Warriors ever suffered, and it demonstrated something that the Emperor may have already known, but that needed to be proven on the battlefield. There were some problems that even the Thunder Warriors could not solve through raw power alone. The second attempt to topple the Ethnarchy was more successful, though it required the deployment of a new and secret weapon, the 18th Legion of the Legiones Astartes, one of the very first Space Marine legions, which was tasked with destroying the subterranean power generators feeding the Ethnarchy's force fields. This was a mission that required stealth, precision, and discipline rather than the raw power that was the Thunder Warriors' specialty. The Space Marines infiltrated the Ethnarchy's underground complexes through tunnels that had been mapped by scouts and saboteurs, moving with a silence and coordination that would have been impossible for the larger, louder, more aggressive Thunder Warriors. They found the generators, planted their charges, and withdrew before the Ethnarchy's defenders even knew they were there. When the charges detonated and the force fields collapsed, the Thunder Warriors were waiting. They surged forward with a vengeance that was fueled by the memory of their earlier defeat, tearing through the now defenseless Ethnarchy positions with a fury that was terrible to behold. The Urkasis warriors, without the protection of their force fields, were overwhelmed in minutes. The enslaved psychers, cut off from the power sources that had amplified their abilities, were silenced quickly and mercilessly. The ethnarchy fell, as all the techno-barbarian states fell, but it fell harder and bloodier than most, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting and the depth of the Thunder Warriors' rage. The fact that Proto-Space Marines were already in existence and being deployed on the battlefield alongside the Thunder Warriors during the later stages of the Unification Wars is a crucial detail, one that speaks directly to the Emperor's long-term plans and the eventual fate of the Thunder Warriors themselves. But we will return to that point shortly. The Unification Wars raged on for decades, a relentless campaign of conquest that gradually brought the entire surface of Terra under the Emperor's control. Battles were fought across every continent, in every climate and terrain, from the frozen wastes of the north to the blistering deserts of the south. How from the ruins of ancient cities to the peaks of mountains that had been fortified into impregnable strongholds. The Thunder Warriors were at the forefront of all of it, leading every major assault, breaking every defensive line, storming every fortress that dared to stand against the Emperor's will. And through it all, they fought with a passion and a fury that was both their greatest strength and their most dangerous weakness. The Thunder Warriors were not like the later Space Marines, whose emotions were carefully modulated and controlled through years of psychological conditioning and the effects of their implanted organs. The Thunder Warriors retained their human emotions in all their raw, unfiltered intensity. They laughed, they grieved, they raged, they exulted. They were known for their dry humor and their love of battle. It's their eagerness to close with the enemy and destroy them in the most personal and violent manner possible. They lived as warlords and relished combat in a way that the more disciplined Astartes never would. This emotional intensity made them devastatingly effective on the battlefield. A Thunder Warrior who charged into battle was not merely following orders or executing a tactical plan. He was living in the moment with an intensity that few other beings in the galaxy could match. His entire being focused on the act of destruction with a purity of purpose that was almost transcendent. When a Thunder Warrior hit an enemy line, he hit it with the full force of his superhuman body and his unrestrained human passion, and the result was carnage on a scale that had to be seen to be believed. There was something almost beautiful about it, as in the terrible way that violence can sometimes be beautiful when it is enacted with absolute commitment and total conviction. The Thunder Warriors did not fight with the mechanical precision of the later Astartes. They fought with the wild, exuberant ferocity of beings who knew, on some deep and fundamental level, that their time was short and that every moment of life was precious. Each battle was not just a tactical engagement, but an affirmation of existence, a declaration that they were alive and powerful and present in a way that transcended the mere physical. When they laughed in the heat of combat, and they did laugh, it was not the grim humor of professionals going about their work. It was the delighted laughter of beings doing the one thing they had been created to do, and doing it supremely well. Their camaraderie, too, was something different from what the later Astartes would develop. The Thunder Warriors' bonds were forged not through years of carefully structured squad-based training, but through shared suffering and shared joy, through the raw emotional connections that form between men who have fought and bled and triumphed together. They told stories around fires. They drank together when drink could be found. They mourned their fallen with genuine tears rather than stoic silence. They were, in many ways, more human than the Astartes who replaced them, their augmented bodies containing hearts that still beat with unmistakable human passion. This is what makes their story so profoundly tragic. They were not mindless killing machines. They were people. Enhanced, augmented, transformed beyond recognition, but still people. Yet they had names and faces and personalities. They had friends and rivals and mentors. They had favorite weapons and preferred tactics and personal grudges that they carried from one campaign to the next. They told jokes, some of which survive in fragmentary records and are, by all accounts, surprisingly witty for beings whose reputation is primarily one of ultraviolence. They had dreams, though those dreams were increasingly shadowed by the growing awareness that something was wrong with their bodies, that the fire burning inside them was consuming them from within. And when the end came, when the betrayal fell upon them like a blade in the dark, they felt it. Not as a tactical setback or a strategic reversal, but as the deeply personal wound that it was. They felt the hurt of it, the injustice of it, yet the overwhelming grief of knowing that the being they had served with everything they had, the being they had loved and worshipped and followed to the ends of the earth, had decided that they were no longer worth keeping alive. But that same emotional intensity also made them unpredictable and, at times, uncontrollable. The berserker episodes that had first been observed during the Battle of Morland Sen continued to occur throughout the Unification Wars, particularly when the Thunder Warriors encountered warp energy or chaos-corrupted opponents. And even without the influence of the warp, the Thunder Warriors could be difficult to rein in, their aggression and bloodlust sometimes overriding tactical considerations and leading to unnecessary casualties among both enemy and friendly forces. As more troubling still were the first signs of what would eventually become the Thunder Warriors' fatal flaw, genetic instability. The augmentation process that had created the Thunder Warriors was, for all the Emperor's genius, imperfect. The changes that had been wrought upon their bodies were not perfectly stable, not perfectly integrated into their biology. Over time, some Thunder Warriors began to experience a deterioration of their enhanced physiology, a gradual breakdown of the very modifications that made them superhuman. Some suffered metabolic collapse, their enhanced systems suddenly and catastrophically failing without warning. Others experienced mental instability, their emotions becoming increasingly erratic and violent, their ability to distinguish friend from foe degraded, their capacity for rational thought diminished, and a few simply dropped dead, their bodies giving out without any warning or explanation. Imagine what that was like. Imagine being one of the most powerful beings on the planet, a warrior whose strength could shatter walls and whose speed could outpace gunfire, and waking up one morning to find that your hands are trembling. Not from fear, not from cold, but from something happening deep inside your cells, something you cannot see or fight or defeat. Imagine the slow realization that the power you have relied upon your entire enhanced existence is beginning to fail, that the body which has been your greatest weapon is becoming your worst enemy. Some Thunder Warriors experience the deterioration as a physical process. Muscles that had been augmented to superhuman levels began to waste. Our bones that had been reinforced to resist any impact began to crack under stresses they had once shrugged off. Organs that had been modified to function at extraordinary levels of efficiency began to stutter and fail. The pain that accompanied this deterioration was, by all accounts, constant and severe, a grinding, relentless agony that no amount of willpower could suppress. The Thunder Warriors had been created with extraordinary pain tolerance, but there are limits to what even the most enhanced physiology can endure, and many of them lived their final years in a state of perpetual suffering that would have been unbearable for any ordinary human. Others experienced the deterioration primarily as a mental phenomenon. Their minds, which had been enhanced alongside their bodies to provide the tactical acumen and strategic awareness needed for effective combat, began to fragment. Memories became unreliable. Emotional control, never the Thunder Warrior's strongest attribute, deteriorated further, leading to explosive episodes of rage or despair that could be triggered by the slightest provocation. Some Thunder Warriors became paranoid, seeing enemies in every shadow and treachery in every gesture. Others became depressive, overwhelmed by a crushing sense of futility that robbed them of the will to fight, to move, to live. A few developed psychotic episodes, losing touch with reality entirely and lashing out at anyone and anything within reach. The cruelest aspect of the mental deterioration was that it was intermittent. A Thunder Warrior might be perfectly lucid one day and completely unhinged the next, the episodes of instability coming and going without warning or pattern. This unpredictability made the affected warriors dangerous, not just to themselves, but to everyone around them, including their fellow Thunder Warriors and the mortal soldiers who fought alongside them. There are fragmentary accounts of Thunder Warriors suddenly turning on their own comrades in the middle of battle, their minds overwhelmed by a sudden surge of uncontrolled aggression that they could not direct or suppress. In one particularly harrowing account, a Thunder Warrior in the grip of a psychotic episode killed 17 Imperial Army soldiers before his brothers could subdue him. He was found afterward in a state of total confusion, was unable to remember what he had done, and horrified when he was told. These incidents were, at first, rare enough to be dismissed as individual anomalies rather than signs of a systemic problem. But as the unification wars dragged on and the Thunder Warriors accumulated years of service, the frequency of such incidents increased. The Emperor and his gene rights were aware of the issue, but the demands of the ongoing war made it impossible to halt the Thunder Warrior program and address the underlying genetic flaws. The war had to be won, and the Thunder Warriors were the instruments of that victory. Whatever problems they had, they would have to be dealt with later. Yes, this brings us to one of the most morally fraught questions in the entire history of the Imperium. Did the Emperor know from the beginning that the Thunder Warriors were flawed? Did he deliberately engineer them with limited lifespans, creating them as disposable weapons that were never meant to survive beyond the wars they were built to fight? Or was the genetic instability a genuine defect, an unintended consequence of the haste and imperfection that characterized their creation? The answer, like so much about the Emperor, is ambiguous. The Thunder Warrior survivor, Aric Taranis, who lived long enough to investigate the matter himself, suspected that the Emperor had deliberately engineered the Thunder Warriors with a limited lifespan, that the genetic instability was not a flaw, but a feature, in a built-in expiration date that would ensure the Thunder Warriors did not outlive their usefulness. But Taranis also expressed the hope that it was simply a defect, an honest mistake, rather than a calculated cruelty. The truth may lie somewhere between these two extremes. The Emperor may have been aware of the genetic instability from early in the process, but chose to proceed anyway, accepting the flaw as the price of creating warriors powerful enough to win the unification wars in the time available. Whatever the truth, the implications are staggering. If the Emperor deliberately created beings who were destined to suffer and die, who were engineered from the start to be used and discarded, then the foundation of the Imperium is built on one of the most callous acts of betrayal in human history. And if he did not, and if the instability was truly unintended, then the fate of the Thunder Warriors is not a story of betrayal, but of tragedy, of warriors created with the best of intentions who were ultimately undone by the limitations of even the Emperor's extraordinary genius. Either way, the clock was ticking for the Thunder Warriors. But before time ran out, they had one more great task to accomplish, one more campaign to fight, one more victory to win, and one more betrayal to endure. While the Thunder Warriors were fighting and dying across the surface of Terra, something was happening in the deepest dungeons of the Emperor's fortress, beneath the Himalayan mountains. Something secret, something that would change the course of human history forever. But the Emperor had known from early in the unification wars that the Thunder Warriors were not a permanent solution. They were powerful beyond measure, capable of conquering a world, but they were fundamentally unsuited to the greater work that lay ahead. The Emperor's vision extended far beyond the unification of Terra. He intended to launch a great crusade across the entire galaxy, reuniting the scattered worlds of humanity under a single interstellar government, and establishing an Imperium of man that would ensure the survival of the human species against all threats, both terrestrial and cosmic. For this task, he needed warriors who could not only fight, but endure. Soldiers who could survive the rigors of long-duration space travel, adapt to alien environments, and maintain their effectiveness across centuries of continuous warfare without succumbing to genetic breakdown or mental instability. The Thunder Warriors could do none of these things. They were designed for a single world, a single war, a single purpose. They were weapons built for a specific job, and once that job was done, they would have no further use. The Emperor understood this, even if the Thunder Warriors themselves did not. And so, even as the Thunder Warriors were winning the war for Terra, the Emperor was already building their replacements. In the secret laboratories beneath the Himalayas, the Emperor gathered a team of the most brilliant savants and gene-wrights available, some willing servants of his growing Imperium, and others captives taken from conquered enemies. But this team became known as the Imperial Biotechnical Division, and their task was to create a new generation of genetically enhanced warriors that would surpass the Thunder Warriors in every meaningful way. Working for decades in absolute secrecy, this team produced a series of extraordinary achievements, including the Primarchs, the 20 demigod-like beings who would serve as the genetic templates for the Space Marine Legions, and the 20 Space Marine Legions themselves. The Legions Astartes, the successor force that would carry the Emperor's banner to the stars. The Astartes were everything the Thunder Warriors were not. Where the Thunder Warriors were created from adult men through a process of brute force genetic modification, but the Astartes were created from adolescent boys through a far more refined process involving the implantation of 19 specialized organs derived from the genetic material of the Primarchs. Where the Thunder Warriors were genetically unstable and prone to metabolic collapse and mental breakdown, the Astartes were genetically stable, their modifications carefully integrated into their biology to ensure long-term viability. Where the Thunder Warriors were emotionally volatile and difficult to control, the Astartes were psychologically conditioned and hormonally regulated to be disciplined, obedient, and focused. Where the Thunder Warriors were designed for a single world, the Astartes were designed for a galaxy, their biology adapted to survive in any environment from the frozen void of space to the crushing depths of oceanic worlds. And in almost every way, the Astartes were a superior product. They were not as individually powerful as the Thunder Warriors in terms of raw physical strength. It is true, a Thunder Warrior could and often did overpower a Space Marine in one-on-one combat. But the Astartes were vastly superior in terms of consistency, longevity, discipline, adaptability, and scalability. They could be produced in far greater numbers, maintained in service for far longer, deployed in far more diverse environments, and relied upon to follow orders with far greater precision. They were not mere weapons. They were soldiers in the fullest sense of the word, capable of sustained campaigning across centuries without the degradation that plagued the Thunder Warriors. Let me break down the comparison more specifically. But because understanding the differences between the Thunder Warriors and the Astartes is crucial to understanding why the Emperor made the choices he did. In terms of raw physical power, the Thunder Warriors held a clear advantage. They were bigger, stronger, and more aggressive than the Astartes, with a combat style that prioritized overwhelming force and individual prowess. In a straight-up fight, one-on-one, in close quarters, a Thunder Warrior would beat an Astartes more often than not. The evidence for this is overwhelming. The Cerberus insurrection, where deteriorating Thunder Warriors killed 4 to 5 Astartes for each Thunder Warrior lost. The accounts of surviving Thunder Warriors easily handling multiple Space Marines simultaneously. The testimony of witnesses who described Thunder Warriors as being closer in individual combat power to the Custodian Guard than to the Astartes. But war is not fought one-on-one, and combat power is not the only measure of a soldier's worth. In terms of discipline, the Astartes were vastly superior. The Thunder Warriors retained their human emotions in all their raw intensity, which gave them passion and ferocity, but also made them unpredictable and difficult to command. The Astartes, by contrast, were psychologically conditioned from adolescence to obey orders, work as part of a team, and subordinate their individual desires to the needs of their legion. A thunder warrior might charge ahead of his brothers in a moment of berserker fury, exposing a flank or disrupting a carefully planned formation. An Astartes would hold his position. He maintain his fire discipline and trust in his brothers to do the same. In terms of longevity, there was no comparison at all. The Thunder Warriors were burning out. Their bodies were failing, their minds were deteriorating, and there was no way to halt or reverse the process. An Astartes could serve for centuries, potentially even millennia, without significant degradation. For a campaign that would span the entire galaxy and last for generations, longevity was not a luxury, but a necessity. You cannot conquer 1,000,000 worlds with warriors who might drop dead at any moment. In terms of adaptability, the Astartes again held the advantage. The Thunder Warriors had been designed for fighting on Terra, in terrestrial conditions, against human opponents. Their armor was not sealed against vacuum, and their physiology was not adapted for alien environments. They had no equivalent of the Astartes organs that allowed space marines to breathe toxic atmospheres, survive in the void of space, or adapt to extreme gravitational conditions. For a galactic crusade that would take the Emperor's armies to worlds of every conceivable type, from frozen ice worlds to burning forge worlds to airless asteroid colonies, the Thunder Warriors were simply not equipped for the task. And in terms of scalability, the Astartes process was far more efficient. The Thunder Warriors were created from adult subjects through a process that was invasive, agonizing, and often fatal. The Astartes were created from adolescent subjects through a process that, while still demanding and dangerous, was more refined, more systematic, and more likely to succeed. The gene seed technology that made the Astartes possible allowed for a degree of standardization and mass production that was impossible with the Thunder Warriors' more individualistic augmentation process. The Emperor could produce thousands of Astartes in the time it would take to create a few hundred Thunder Warriors, and those Astartes would be more reliable, more consistent, and more long-lasting than their predecessors. The conclusion was inescapable. For the Great Crusade, the Astartes were the better choice, not because they were better warriors in any individual sense, but because they were better soldiers, better instruments of the Emperor's strategic vision, better suited to the specific demands of a galaxy-spanning campaign of conquest and unification. The Thunder Warriors were the hammer, the Astartes were the machine, and in a war that would be won by logistics and endurance as much as by courage and strength, the machine was what was needed. Into the creation of the Astartes went all the hard-won knowledge and genetic lore accumulated during the Age of Strife, the lessons learned from both the successes and the failures of the Thunder Warriors, and the fruits of the Emperor's own unparalleled genius. The Thunder Warriors were the rough draft, the proof of concept. The Astartes were the finished product, refined and perfected through years of painstaking research and development. Everything the Emperor had learned from creating the Thunder Warriors, every flaw he had identified, every weakness he had observed, was addressed and corrected in the Astartes design. The first Space Marines were hand-picked men from the Emperor's personal, mortal bodyguard. These volunteers were subjected to surgical, genetic, and psychological modification, and through rigorous training and appropriate mental conditioning, they became not only immensely strong and tough, but iron-willed and disciplined, an unstoppable force whose loyalty to the Emperor was unflinching. The process was quickly refined and systematized, and the numbers of the new genetically enhanced warriors grew swiftly. They were organized into 20 distinct regiments, mirroring the structure of the 20 Thunder Warrior legions, and equipped initially with the same Mark I Thunder armor that the Thunder Warriors wore before being upgraded to the newer, fully enclosed Mark II Crusade armor that would be standard issue for the Great Crusade. But the gene seed technology that made the Astartes possible was a revolutionary advancement over the Thunder Warriors' augmentation process, where the Thunder Warriors had been enhanced through alchemical augmentation and muscle grafting. The Astartes were enhanced through the implantation of 19 specialized organs, each one performing a specific function that contributed to the overall transformation of the recruit into a superhuman warrior. These organs included a secondary heart, enhanced lungs capable of breathing toxic atmospheres, a fused ribcage that provided additional protection for vital organs, enhanced blood that could clot almost instantly, and a wide range of other modifications that made the Astartes capable of surviving conditions that would kill any ordinary human and most Thunder Warriors. While the development of the gene seed also required the gene cults of Luna, which were pacified by the early Astartes and pressed into service to mass-produce the genetic material needed for large-scale space marine creation. This connection to Luna is significant because it demonstrates that the Astartes project was not confined to Terra, but was already reaching out into the wider Sol system, even before the formal beginning of the Great Crusade. It is crucial to understand the timeline here. The Space Marines were not created after the Thunder Warriors were eliminated. They were being developed and deployed alongside the Thunder Warriors during the later stages of the Unification Wars. Proto-legions of Astartes, up to and including the 18th Legion, theirs were already seeing active combat on Terra before the Thunder Warriors were retired. The First Legion, which would later become the Dark Angels, was already established and operational. The Emperor had been running both programs in parallel, using the Thunder Warriors to win the war while simultaneously building the force that would replace them. This overlapping existence is one of the most tragically ironic aspects of the Thunder Warriors' story. They were fighting and dying to conquer a world, never knowing that the warriors being built beneath their feet were designed to make them obsolete. Every battle they won, every territory they conquered, every fortress they stormed, brought them one step closer not to glory and reward, but to their own obsolescence and ultimately their destruction. There must have been a moment, for some of the Thunder Warriors at least, when the pieces began to fall into place. A moment when they saw the new warriors for the first time and felt a cold hand close around their hearts. The Astartes were different in ways that were immediately apparent. They were quieter, more disciplined, more uniform. Where the Thunder Warriors were a riot of individual expression, each one a unique combination of physical prowess and personal style, the Astartes moved in lockstep, their actions coordinated with a precision that spoke of a fundamentally different approach to warfare. They wore the same armor as the Thunder Warriors at first, but they wore it differently, with a uniformity and standardization that the individualistic Thunder Warriors had never embraced. Did the Thunder Warriors understand what the Astartes represented? Yet did they look at these new, sleek, disciplined warriors and see their own replacements? Or did they dismiss them, confident in their own superiority, certain that no mass-produced soldier could match the raw power of the Emperor's original creations? The records do not tell us, but the question haunts the story of the Thunder Warriors like a ghost, a what-if that will never be answered. Some of the Thunder Warriors must have seen the writing on the wall. Some of them must have noticed the new warriors appearing on the battlefield alongside them, warriors who were different, more disciplined, more uniform, more controlled. Some of them must have wondered what it meant, must have asked questions that received evasive answers or no answers at all. But for most of the Thunder Warriors, the war was all that mattered. They had been created to fight, and fighting was what they did. The future was an abstract concept for beings whose lives burned so bright and so briefly. And then the war ended, and the future arrived. The Imperial Historical Chronicles tell a heroic story about the end of the Unification Wars. According to the official version, the last battle was fought at Mount Ararat in the kingdom of Urartu in the year 669 of the 30th millennium. During this final, climactic engagement, the remaining Thunder Warriors fought with incredible heroism against the last holdout of the techno-barbarian warlords, sacrificing themselves to the last warrior to secure the Emperor's final victory. The most famous of the Thunder Warriors, Arik Taranis, known as the Lightning Bearer, raised the banner of lightning at the very moment that unity was declared, at the moment when the Emperor's rule over the entirety of Terra was formally established, before succumbing to the wounds he had sustained in the battle. It was a beautiful story, a story of sacrifice and glory, of warriors who gave everything for their emperor and their species, of heroes whose names would be remembered forever alongside the great deeds that had secured the future of humanity. It was also completely false. The truth about what happened at Mount Ararat and in its aftermath is one of the darkest secrets of the Imperium, a lie so fundamental that it undermines the very foundations of everything the Emperor claimed to stand for. The Thunder Warriors did not die heroically in a final battle against the last enemies of unity. They were culled, deliberately, systematically, on the orders of the Emperor himself. While the details of how the cull was carried out are fragmentary and often contradictory, pieced together from the accounts of the few Thunder Warriors who survived and the oblique references in later imperial records. But the broad outlines of what happened are clear enough. At some point during or shortly after the Battle of Mount Ararat, the Emperor ordered the elimination of the remaining Thunder Warriors. The agents of this elimination were the Legio Custodes, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, who were the only warriors in the imperial forces capable of defeating the Thunder Warriors in combat. The Custodes, accompanied in some accounts by the first proto-space marines of the First Legion, fell upon the Thunder Warriors and slaughtered them. The mechanics of the cull are not entirely clear, but we can piece together a general picture from the available sources. The Thunder Warriors had been deployed at the front of the assault, as they always were, absorbing the brunt of the enemy fire and clearing the way for the forces that followed. They would have been exhausted, wounded, and scattered across the battlefield, their attention focused entirely on the enemy in front of them. They would have had no reason to suspect that the greatest threat they faced was behind them. The Custodian Guard struck at the moment of maximum vulnerability. They came from behind, from within the Emperor's own lines, turning on the Thunder Warriors with the same lethal efficiency they normally reserved for the Emperor's enemies. The Custodes were, individually, even more formidable than the Thunder Warriors. Each one a unique work of bioalchemy and martial training that surpassed even the Emperor's first creations. And they had the advantage of surprise, of numbers, and of the Emperor's own authority behind their actions. The slaughter was swift, but not without resistance. Some Thunder Warriors fought back when they realized what was happening, turning their weapons on their erstwhile allies with the same fury they had shown against the enemies of the Emperor. But they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. The Custodes knew their capabilities, knew their tactics, knew their weaknesses, and exploited every advantage with the cold precision that was their hallmark. Imagine the confusion. Imagine the betrayal. You have just fought through the most brutal battle of a war that has consumed years of your life. You have bled for the Emperor, killed for the Emperor, watched your brothers die for the Emperor. You are standing in the ruins of the last enemy fortress, the banner of unity rising above the smoke and the carnage, and for the first time in as long as you can remember, you feel something approaching hope. The war is over. The fighting is done. And then the blade comes from behind. Some of the Thunder Warriors must have died without ever understanding what had happened to them. Others must have had just enough time to recognize the golden armor of the Custodes, to feel the shock of recognition as they realized that the warriors they had fought alongside for years were now cutting them down like animals. A few must have tried to run, tried to escape the killing field, tried to reach safety in the ruins of the battlefield or the tunnels beneath the fortress. Some of them succeeded, most did not. Within hours, the Thunder Legions were effectively destroyed, their survivors scattered and hunted, their names struck from the rolls of honor, and their achievements attributed to others or simply erased. The cover story was put in place almost immediately, a carefully constructed fiction that explained the Thunder Warriors' disappearance without raising uncomfortable questions. Within a generation, the official version of events had become accepted fact, and the true fate of the Thunder Warriors had passed from memory into the realm of forbidden knowledge. There are different versions of why this happened. One account suggests that the Thunder Warriors, as upon discovering the truth about their limited lifespans and the existence of the Space Marines who had been built to replace them, revolted against the Emperor, and the Custodes were deployed to put down the rebellion. Another version suggests that the cull was more premeditated, that the Emperor had always planned to eliminate the Thunder Warriors once the Unification Wars were over, and that the Battle of Mount Ararat was simply the cover story used to explain their sudden disappearance from the historical record. A third version suggests something more ambiguous, that the emperor may not have ordered a deliberate massacre, but rather chose not to replenish the Thunder Warriors' numbers as they succumbed to genetic deterioration, effectively allowing them to die out rather than actively killing them. Aric Taranis, the most famous Thunder Warrior survivor, was characteristically ambiguous on the subject. He suggested that the emperor had either massacred the Thunder Warriors outright or used the Battle of Mount Ararat to expend the last of them, fabricating the tale of their heroic sacrifice as a cover story. But Taranis also admitted that he held no ill will toward the emperor for what had happened, suggesting that he understood, on some level, the cold logic behind the decision. And in fairness, there was a cold logic to it. The Thunder Warriors were genetically unstable, prone to violent outbursts, and impossible to control for extended periods. They were not suited for the Emperor's long-term plans, which called for warriors who could serve for centuries without breaking down. They were a potential threat to the very Imperium they had helped to create, a force of superhuman warriors with no role to play in peacetime and no ability to integrate into the society they had been built to defend. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, eliminating them was the rational choice. But pragmatism, however rational, does not answer the moral question. These were not machines to be scrapped when a better model became available. They were living beings, created by the Emperor's own will, given consciousness and purpose, and the capacity for suffering. They had served faithfully, fought bravely, and suffered enormously in the Emperor's name. They had been promised glory and honor and a place in the history of humanity's greatest achievement. And in the end, they received none of those things. They received only death, delivered by the hands of the very master they had served, and a lie to cover the stain of their murder. The moral implications of the cull have been debated for 10,000 years, at least among those few individuals who are aware of the true history. There are those who argue that the Emperor's decision was justified, that the needs of humanity as a whole outweighed the rights of any individual group, and that the Thunder Warriors' elimination prevented potential catastrophe. There are others who argue that no utilitarian calculus can justify the betrayal and murder of loyal soldiers, that the Emperor's actions were a fundamental violation of the trust that should exist between a leader and his followers. And there are still others who see the cull as evidence of a deeper flaw in the Emperor's character, and a willingness to treat sentient beings as tools rather than people, a pragmatism so extreme that it shades into something that can only be called evil. There is no easy answer, and I am not going to pretend that there is. The Emperor's decision to cull the Thunder Warriors is one of those moral dilemmas that does not have a clean resolution, one of those questions that reveals more about the person asking it than about the situation itself. What I will say is this: whatever the strategic justification for the cull, the manner in which it was carried out, the deception, the betrayal, the erasure of history, speaks to something deeply troubling about the nature of the Imperium and the being who created it. A truly just ruler would have found another way, as a truly honorable leader would have at least had the courage to look his soldiers in the eye and tell them why they had to die. The Emperor did neither of these things, and that failure, more than any other single act, set the tone for the 10,000 years of tyranny and oppression that followed. But pragmatism and morality are not always the same thing. The Thunder Warriors had served the Emperor faithfully, had fought and bled and died for his vision of a united humanity. They had earned their place in the history of the Imperium through sacrifice and suffering on a scale that few other beings could comprehend. To repay that service with betrayal, to murder the very warriors who had made the Emperor's dream possible, it is an act of such profound ingratitude and cruelty that it casts a shadow over everything the Emperor claimed to represent. This is the moral heart of the Thunder Warriors' story, and it is one of the reasons why their tale resonates so powerfully within the Warhammer 40,000 setting. The Imperium of Man, for all its grandeur and power, was built on a lie. The first act of the Emperor's newly unified terror was the betrayal and murder of the warriors who had made that unity possible. The very foundation of the Imperium is stained with the blood of its most loyal servants, and the heroic narrative that was constructed to conceal that crime is one of the oldest and most enduring deceptions in Imperial history. In the novel, Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, by Chris Raitt, this betrayal is explored with particular depth and nuance. Yet the story follows Constantine Valdor, the Captain General of the Legio Custodes, as he navigates the treacherous political landscape of the newly unified Terra. One of the central threads of the narrative involves Grand Provost Marshal Uwoma Kandawire, one of the first High Lords of Terra, who becomes suspicious about the disappearance of the Thunder Warriors and begins to investigate. Her investigation brings her into conflict with Valdor, who was directly responsible for carrying out the cull, and the resulting political maneuvering and moral debate forms the heart of the story. What makes the novel so compelling is its refusal to provide easy answers. Valdor is not portrayed as a villain, despite his role in the cull. He is shown as a being who is deeply conflicted about what he has done, or who understands the moral weight of his actions, even as he argues that they were necessary. He admired the Thunder Warriors, admired their courage and their ferocity, and took no pleasure in their destruction. But he also understood, as the Emperor understood, that the Thunder Warriors were a problem that could not be solved, a force that had outlived its purpose and had become a threat to the very Imperium it had helped to create. The climax of the novel involves the palace coup, an event that brings the Thunder Warriors' story to a dramatic and tragic conclusion. A group of at least 24 surviving Thunder Warriors, led by Ushatan, the Primarch of the 4th Legion, allied themselves with Kandawire in an attempt to hold Valdor and the Emperor accountable for the destruction of their kind. Let us pause on Ushotan for a moment, because he is a figure who deserves more attention than he typically receives. Ushatan was the Primarch of the 4th Legion of the Thunder Warriors, the Iron Lords, specialists in siege warfare. He had led his warriors through some of the most brutal campaigns of the Unification Wars, breaking through fortifications that had withstood every other assault, cracking open strongholds that had been considered impregnable. He was a warrior of exceptional skill and a leader of proven ability, respected by his brothers and feared by his enemies, and he had survived the cull. Think about what that survival must have cost him, not just physically, not just the pain of genetic deterioration and the constant threat of discovery, but psychologically. Ushotan had been a Primarch, a commander of hundreds, as a leader who had moved armies and shaped the course of the Unification Wars. And then overnight, he had become nothing, a fugitive, a hunted animal, hiding in the shadows of the very palace he had helped to build, watching as the warriors who had replaced him were celebrated and honored while his own kind were erased from history. The indignity of it, the sheer unfairness, must have been almost as painful as the physical deterioration that was slowly destroying his body. When Kandawire approached the surviving Thunder Warriors with her plan to confront Valdor and demand accountability, Ushotan must have seen it as his last chance, not just for justice, but for meaning. His life was ending, his body was failing, his brothers were scattered and dying, but he could still fight. He could still stand before the being who had ordered his destruction and demand to know why. He could still, in the last act of a life defined by warfare, make his death count for something. The rebellion was short-lived and doomed from the start. Valdor deployed the Proto-Legiones Astartes in their very first openly recognized engagement, unleashing the Emperor's new warriors against the remnants of his old ones. It was, in a sense, the ultimate proof of concept, the Space Marines demonstrating their worth by defeating the warriors they had been built to replace. The Thunder Warriors, for all their individual superiority, were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and discipline of the Astartes. The battle was fierce, but the outcome was never in doubt. Ushotan himself was slain by Valdor in personal combat. The accounts of this fight are sparse, but what exists suggests that Ushotan fought with everything he had. pouring the last of his strength and his fury into a final confrontation with the being who had overseen the destruction of his kind. Valdor, for his part, dispatched the Thunder Warrior Primarch with his typical lethal efficiency, but took no gratification in the act. He had admired Ushotan. He had respected the Thunder Warrior's courage and his skill, and he understood, perhaps better than anyone except the Emperor himself, the terrible necessity that had brought them to this point. In a surprising and revealing gesture, Valdor spared Kandawaya and allowed her to leave the Imperial Palace in peace, suggesting that even the Emperor's most ruthless servant recognized the legitimacy of her concerns about the morality of what had been done to the Thunder Warriors. It was a small mercy in a story that offers few of them, but it spoke to the complexity of the situation and the genuine moral weight of the decisions that had been made. After the palace coup, the surviving Thunder Warriors scattered. Some went into hiding on Terra, living anonymous and miserable lives among the teeming population, always fearful of being discovered. Others managed to escape off-world, fleeing into the wider galaxy to put as much distance between themselves and the Emperor as possible. Those who escaped off-world were later hunted down and destroyed by the First Legion of the Legions Astartes, the future Dark Angels, who were tasked with the grim duty of eliminating the last remnants of the Emperor's first creation. Bands of Thunder Warriors who had gone to ground on Terra were left largely unmolested, if only because the Imperium, believing the Thunder Warriors all dead, never truly organized a systematic search for survivors. All efforts and attention had shifted to the Great Crusade, and the Thunder Warriors were, as far as official history was concerned, a closed chapter. But some survived, and their stories, the stories of the ghosts of the Emperor's first army, are among the most fascinating and heartbreaking tales in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. The most famous Thunder Warrior survivor is, without question, Arik Taranis, the warrior whose legendary deeds during the Unification Wars had made him one of the most celebrated figures of the age. Known by many titles, the Victor of Gadaware, the Last Rider, the Butcher of Scandia, the Throne Slayer, Taranis was a figure of almost mythical stature even during his own lifetime. According to legend, he was taller than the Hollow Mountain and had carved the pass of Mohan with his fists. While these claims were obviously exaggerated, the hyperbolic descriptions of his famous battles were not entirely without foundation. There are accounts of Taranis knocking down the Azurite Tower with his bare hands and participating in conflicts so violent that they literally sundered mountains. After surviving the Kull at Mount Ararat, Taranis went underground in the most literal sense, as he adopted the alias Babu Dakal and established himself as a criminal warlord in the Petitioner's City, a sprawling slum that had grown up around the edges of the Imperial Palace on Terra. Under his assumed identity, Taranis built a criminal empire that encompassed drugs, gambling, weapons, and virtually every other form of illicit trade. He became the undisputed kingpin of Petitioner's City, feared and respected by the criminal underworld. His true identity, a secret known only to himself, and a handful of fellow Thunder Warrior survivors. One of these survivors was Gota, Taranis' lieutenant and closest companion, another Thunder Warrior who had escaped the Kull and taken refuge in the criminal underworld. Gota was described as an enormous, physically imposing figure, larger even than most Space Marines, but showing the visible signs of the genetic deterioration that plagued all surviving Thunder Warriors. His eyes were described as burning with a rage-like intensity, a side effect of the painful physical breakdown that was slowly destroying his body from the inside. During the century he spent in hiding, Taranis dedicated himself to studying the genetic science that had created him, drawing upon whatever knowledge he had learned from the Emperor during the years of the Unification Wars. He maintained a secret genetic laboratory in the heart of Petitioner's City, where he worked to understand and hopefully cure the genetic instability that was slowly killing him and all the other surviving Thunder Warriors. Unfortunately, Taranis' knowledge, while impressive, was not sufficient to halt the cellular deterioration entirely, only enough to desperately cling to life long enough for his fortunes to change. That change came during the opening days of the Horus Heresy, more than a century after the end of the Unification Wars. In the year 005 of the 31st millennium, a group of renegade Astartes known as the Outcast Dead escaped from the prison fortress of Kangba, dug into the rock of a mountain on Terra, its walls clad in adamantium plate. The Outcast Dead were a distinctive group of space marines from various traitor legions, including members of the Thousand Sons, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, Death Guard, and Lunar Wolves, who had been imprisoned on Terra when news of Horus's betrayal reached the imperial capital. Tyrannus encountered the Outcast Dead at the Temple of Woe in the slums of Petitioner's City, where the renegade Astartes had been cornered by an imperial hunter team. During the ensuing battle, most of the Outcast Dead were killed, but Tyrannus and Gota used the distraction to their advantage and managed to escape with a prize of incalculable value: the progenoid glands of one of the fallen Astartes. Progenoid glands are the organs that contain the stored genetic material of all 19 Astartes implants, the biological miracle that makes the creation of new space marines possible. In the hands of anyone other than the Emperor or the most skilled gene wrights of the Imperium, they would have been worthless. But Tyrannus was not just anyone. Deep in the heart of Petitioner's City, in his secret laboratory, Tyrannus experimented with the progenoid glands, using gene samplers to extract the information encoded within the gland's stored zygotes. He decoded the impossibly complex amino acid chains, unraveled the mysteries of the Astartes gene seed, and managed to replicate the process of its creation and clone a new set of progenoid glands from the original sample. This feat was described as something that no other living being in the galaxy, save the Emperor himself, could have accomplished. It was a Primarch-level achievement, an act of scientific genius so extraordinary that it raises profound questions about the true nature of Tyrannus. Some have theorized that Tyrannus was not merely the best of the Thunder Warriors, but something more, a prototype Primarch, as a testbed for technologies and abilities that would later be refined and incorporated into the 20 Primarchs of the Space Marine Legions. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but compelling. A powerful Thousand Sons psyker named Atharva, one of the Outcast Dead, observed Tyrannus and was overwhelmed by what he saw. He described Tyrannus as having an aura too bright to look upon, a presence with a gravity all its own that demanded all attention and fear. The psyker could barely stand to turn his psychic senses on Tyrannus for fear of being overwhelmed. This kind of aura, this overwhelming psychic presence, is something that in the Warhammer 40,000 setting is typically associated only with the Emperor and the Primarchs. For a Thunder Warrior to possess it suggests that Tyrannus was something far more than a simple gene-enhanced warrior. Whether or not Tyrannus was truly a proto-Primarch, his achievement in decoding and replicating the Astartes gene seed was transformative. By splicing elements of the Astartes genetic template into his own deteriorating body, Tyrannus was able to stabilize his genetic structure and halt the cellular degeneration that had been killing him for over a century. He had effectively cured the fatal flaw that had doomed every Thunder Warrior ever created, not through any act of the Emperor's grace, but through his own extraordinary intellect and determination. Think about what that means. For over 100 years, Tyrannus had lived with a death sentence written into his own DNA, watching his body slowly betray him, and feeling the strength that had once been limitless gradually ebbing away, knowing that each day brought him closer to the final collapse that had already claimed so many of his brothers. And yet he refused to die. He refused to accept the fate that had been engineered into his very cells. With nothing but salvaged equipment, stolen genetic material, and the knowledge he had absorbed from watching the Emperor work, he accomplished what the most brilliant scientists of the Imperium could not. He fixed what had been deliberately broken. There is something deeply satisfying about this, a poetic justice in the fact that the Emperor's most disposable creation proved himself to be, in some ways, the Emperor's intellectual equal. The Thunder Warriors were supposed to be simple weapons, tools to be used and discarded. But Tyrannus was never simple, never merely a weapon. He was a thinking, feeling, dreaming being, and when the system tried to destroy him, he used his mind to save himself. He beat the system on its own terms, using the very science that had created him to undo the death sentence that had been built into his creation. The fate of Aric Tyrannus after this point is uncertain. His story was left open-ended, with the implication that he remained on Terra during the Horus Heresy and might have played a role in the events of the Siege of Terra. Given that Tyrannus was one of the most powerful individual warriors on the planet, a being whose combat abilities rivaled those of the Astartes, and whose psychic presence had overwhelmed a veteran Thousand Sons sorcerer, on his presence during the greatest battle in human history would have been significant indeed. But whether he chose to fight for the Emperor who had betrayed him, or against him, or simply to watch from the shadows as the Imperium tore itself apart, remains a mystery. Other Thunder Warrior survivors had less dramatic but equally poignant fates. 4 Thunder Warriors who had escaped the Cull served as gladiators in the depths of an arena known as the Maw, near the slums of the Outer Palace region called the Swath. These warriors, kept alive by a former astropath named Tarigata, who helped them survive by transplanting organs from deceased Thunder Warriors, fought for the entertainment of crowds who had no idea what they were actually watching. They were living fossils, a remnants of an age that the Imperium had deliberately erased from its history, surviving on the margins of society in the shadow of the very palace they had helped to build. There is something almost unbearably poignant about this image. These were warriors who had once strode across battlefields like gods of war, who had broken armies and shattered empires and conquered a world for the Emperor of mankind. And now they were fighting for the amusement of the masses in a grimy arena in the slums of the Imperial Palace, their once magnificent bodies deteriorating with each passing year, their identities hidden behind assumed names and carefully maintained anonymity. The crowds who watched them fight did not know they were watching the last survivors of the Unification Wars, the final remnants of the force that had made the Imperium possible. Or they saw only what Tarigata wanted them to see: large, powerful fighters of mysterious origin who provided good entertainment. Tarigata herself is a fascinating figure, a former astropath whose connection to the Thunder Warriors speaks to the bonds that formed between the augmented warriors and the mortal humans who served alongside them. She had dedicated her life to keeping the 4 surviving Thunder Warriors alive, using her knowledge of biology and her contacts in the underworld to obtain the organs and materials needed to stave off their genetic deterioration. It was a losing battle, a rearguard action against the inexorable march of biological decay, but she fought it with the same determination that the Thunder Warriors themselves brought to every battle they had ever faced. The gladiators of the Maw were named Kabe, Gairok, Vezula Volt, and Dahren Heruk, and each met an end that reflected the tragedy of their existence. Their stories ended, one by one, in tragedy. Kaiba died after being incapacitated in a gladiator battle against a chrono gladiator, then ceremonially executed by a fellow Thunder Warrior. Gairok became mentally unstable, his mind deteriorating along with his body, and was slain when he attacked one of his own brothers. Vezula Volt died fighting a demonically possessed Alpha Legion Astartes, blinded by the legionary's acidic spit and eviscerated before he could deliver a killing blow. The last of the 4, Dahren Heruk, earned an honored death at the hands of a custodian after he had saved the custodian's life by defeating the possessed Astartes. It was a small gesture of respect from the very organization that had been responsible for the destruction of his kind, a recognition that even in their degraded and diminished state, the Thunder Warriors were still warriors deserving of honor. Perhaps the most dramatic tale of Thunder Warrior survival after the Cull is the story of the Cerberus insurrection, a conflict fought during the early years of the Great Crusade that stands as the only confirmed instance of Space Marines and Thunder Warriors facing each other in full-scale combat. The insurrection took place on Cerberus, an asteroid penal colony that had erupted into anarchic revolt. Among the insurrectionists was a renegade cadre of outlawed Thunder Warriors who called themselves the Diet Tar. How these Thunder Warriors came to be on Cerberus, if far from Terra and beyond the reach of the Imperium's normal surveillance, remains a mystery. All Thunder Warriors were supposed to be long dead by this point, and the presence of a group of them on a distant asteroid prison colony raises questions that Imperial authorities have never satisfactorily answered. One possibility is that the Diet Tar had deliberately sought out the most remote, most forgotten corner of the Imperium's domain, a place so insignificant and so miserable that no one would think to look for them there. An asteroid penal colony was, in many ways, the perfect hiding place for beings who were supposed to be extinct. The guards and administrators of such a colony would have had neither the knowledge nor the capability to identify Thunder Warriors among their prisoner population, and the chaotic, violent nature of life in a penal colony would have provided ample cover for beings whose enhanced physicality and aggressive tendencies might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention. Another possibility, darker and more troubling, is that the Diet Tar were not hiding at all, but waiting for an opportunity to strike back at the Imperium that had betrayed them, waiting for a chance to remind the galaxy that the Emperor's forgotten warriors were not as dead as the official histories claimed. The revolt on Cerberus may not have been a spontaneous uprising that the Diet Tar simply joined, but a carefully orchestrated insurrection that the Thunder Warriors themselves had planned and initiated. When initial attempts by the Terran 22nd Dracos Regiment of the Imperial Army to impose order on Cerberus were thrown back in disarray, the Emperor himself dispatched the 12th Legion, the Warhounds, later known as the World Eaters, with explicit instructions to reclaim the colony and carry his wrath to those who had defied him. The irony of sending one of the most brutal Space Marine legions to deal with warriors who had been discarded for being too brutal was apparently not lost on the Emperor. What followed was 5 hours of the most vicious, close-quarters fighting in the early history of the Great Crusade. The Warhounds, who would go on to earn a reputation as one of the most ferociously effective legions in the Imperium's arsenal, slaughtered the ordinary prisoners with their typical efficiency. But when they encountered the Diet Tar, their confidence was severely shaken. Despite being greatly outnumbered, and despite the ongoing physical deterioration that affected all surviving Thunder Warriors, the Diet Tar fought with a ferocity and power that stunned even the Warhounds. Picture the corridors of Cerberus. Narrow, low-ceilinged, dimly lit tunnels carved into the heart of an asteroid, designed for the confinement of prisoners, not for large-scale military operations. The Warhounds advanced in tactical formations, their bolt pistols and chain axes at the ready, expecting to encounter nothing more dangerous than the desperate, poorly armed convicts they had been killing all day. And then, from the shadows at the far end of a corridor, a shape emerged that was wrong in ways that the Warhounds could not immediately process. The Diet Tar were bigger than the Astartes, and that was the first thing the Warhounds noticed, the first detail that told them something was fundamentally different about these enemies. In a galaxy where Space Marines were the largest, most physically imposing warriors in existence, encountering beings who were larger still must have been profoundly disorienting. The Thunder Warriors filled the corridors of Cerberus like giants in a rabbit warren, their massive frames barely fitting through doorways that the Astartes had passed through with room to spare. The second thing the Warhounds noticed was the speed. The Diet Tar moved with a swiftness that contradicted their massive size, closing the distance between themselves and the Astartes before the Warhounds could bring their ranged weapons to bear. In the tight confines of the asteroid tunnels, where there was no room to maneuver and no space to establish firing lines, the Thunder Warriors' close-quarters superiority was amplified to devastating effect. The third thing the Warhounds noticed, the thing that many of them noticed only in the final moments of their lives, was the strength. A Thunder Warrior's fist could punch through ceramite power armor. Their grip could crush an Astartes helmet like an empty can. Their kicks could send a fully armored Space Marine flying backward through the air to crash against the tunnel walls with force sufficient to shatter the stone. In close combat, in the confined spaces of the Cerberus tunnels, the Thunder Warriors' physical superiority was not just an advantage. It was an overwhelming, decisive factor that rendered the Warhounds' superior training and discipline almost irrelevant. The aftermath told its own grim story. The cleanup forces that entered Cerberus after the fighting was over found scenes of carnage that defied easy description. There were multiple reports of coming across the hulking carcasses of Thunder Warriors, each surrounded by 4 or 5 dead space marines, rooms that had been turned into blood-soaked charnel houses where the close-quarters fighting had been so intense that walls and floors were coated in a thick layer of gore. The Thunder Warriors had killed 3 to 4 times their number in Astartes before being overwhelmed, a kill ratio that speaks volumes about the raw combat power of humanity's first super soldiers, even in their diminished state. As the casualty ratios of the Cerberus insurrection point to an inconvenient truth that the Imperium has never been comfortable acknowledging. On a one-on-one basis, in close-quarters combat, Thunder Warriors were superior to Space Marines, not by a small margin, but by a significant and consistent one. The Space Marines won at Cerberus, not through individual superiority, but through overwhelming numbers, better equipment, superior discipline, and the kind of coordinated tactical approach that the Thunder Warriors' more individualistic fighting style could not match. It was a victory of the system over the individual, of the refined product over the raw prototype. The entire Cerberus insurrection was classified as highly secret by the Imperium, and it remains one of the most carefully guarded secrets in Imperial history. Yet the Imperium could not afford to have the story of the Thunder Warriors become public knowledge, could not allow people to learn that the Emperor's first super soldiers had not died heroic deaths at Mount Ararat, but had been murdered by the Emperor's own servants, and that the survivors remained dangerous enough to slaughter Space Marines at a rate of 4 or 5 to 1. Such knowledge would undermine the legitimacy of the Imperium itself, calling into question the Emperor's judgment, his morality, and the entire foundation of the interstellar civilization he had built. There is one more figure who must be discussed in the context of Thunder Warrior survivors, though his status is more ambiguous, and his story is, in many ways, the most action-packed of them all. Endrid Har was a Space Marine of the 12th Legion, the World Eaters, who distinguished himself during the Cerberus insurrection by killing one of the Diet Tar Thunder Warriors in single combat, snapping his neck in hand-to-hand fighting. This would be impressive enough for any Space Marine, but what makes Har truly remarkable is the strong circumstantial evidence suggesting that he was himself a Thunder Warrior, or at least a closely related type of Proto-Astartes, who had been successfully transformed into a Space Marine. The evidence for this theory is extensive and compelling. Har was described as being far larger, stronger, and quicker than other Space Marines, physically imposing even by the standards of the already massive World Eaters. He was extremely brutal and somewhat mentally unstable, and traits that were present even without the butcher's nails implants that would later drive most World Eaters to madness. He originated from the Imperial gene works on Terra, suggesting that he had undergone some form of genetic modification before being transformed into a Space Marine, and he himself confirmed that he had fought alongside the Emperor in the Unification Wars and referred to the Diet Tar Thunder Warriors as brothers. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor and one of the most formidable minds in the nascent Imperium, singled Har out as a special case, suggesting that his origins were known and considered significant by the highest levels of Imperial leadership. The implication is that Har was one of the Thunder Warriors who, rather than being culled or going into hiding, it was successfully converted into a Space Marine, his Thunder Warrior augmentations incorporated into and supplemented by the Astartes gene seed implants. If this is true, then Har represents a fascinating possibility, proof that the Thunder Warriors and the Astartes technologies were not fundamentally incompatible, and that the Thunder Warriors could have been upgraded rather than destroyed if the Emperor had chosen to go that route. Har went on to become one of the most formidable warriors of the Horus Heresy era, a figure of almost legendary ferocity, whose exploits during the Galactic Civil War earned him a reputation that rivaled any Space Marine of his time. When he learned of Horus's betrayal and the corruption of his own legion, he renounced the World Eaters with an intensity that was characteristic of everything he did. He erased the World Eaters' colors and heraldry from his armor, declaring himself a Black Shield, a space marine without allegiance to any legion, loyal only to the Emperor and to his own burning desire for vengeance. He organized a warband called the Fangs of the Emperor, composed of loyalist space marines from various traitor legions who had been abandoned or cast out by their corrupted brothers. Death Guard, who had refused Nurgle's gifts. Iron Warriors, who would not bend the knee to Perturabo's madness. Raven Guard, who had been cut off and left for dead. Har gathered them all under his banner, forging them into a fighting force of remarkable diversity and surprising effectiveness, bound together not by shared gene seed or legion identity, but by shared purpose, the destruction of the traitors. Har led his warband in a relentless campaign of vengeance across the galaxy, attacking traitor forces wherever he found them with a ferocity that was terrible, even by the standards of the Horus heresy. He was obsessed with killing Horus, the arch-traitor, the being who had torn the Imperium apart and plunged the galaxy into the greatest war in human history. Every battle Har fought, every enemy he destroyed, was a step on the road to that ultimate confrontation. During the Siege of Terra itself, the final and most devastating battle of the Horus heresy, Har participated in the defense of the Saturnine Gate, one of the most critical defensive positions in the Imperial Palace. He was part of the kill teams deployed to protect the gate from the Sons of Horus' subterranean assault, fighting alongside some of the most legendary warriors of the era, including Garviel Loken, Nathaniel Garrow, and Helig Gallo. In the battle beneath Saturnine, Har came face to face with Ezekiel Abaddon, the first captain of the Sons of Horus and one of the most powerful space marines ever created, a warrior who would go on to become the Warmaster of Chaos and the greatest enemy the Imperium has ever faced. It took Abaddon 7 killing strikes to bring Har down, 7 blows from one of the most formidable fighters in the galaxy to fell a single warrior. And even in death, Har's massive body nearly prevented Abaddon from escaping, his bulk blocking the traitor captain's retreat until the teleportation beacon activated and whisked Abaddon away at the last possible moment. 7 killing strikes from Abaddon. Think about that. Abaddon, and who would go on to lead 13 Black Crusades against the Imperium. Abaddon, who would become the Warmaster of Chaos, the chosen of the Dark Gods, the destroyer of Cadia. It took that Abaddon 7 strikes to kill Endrid Har. If Har was truly a former Thunder Warrior, then his death beneath the Saturnine Gate was the final proof of everything the Thunder Warriors had always been. Harder to kill, harder to stop, harder to break than anything else the galaxy had ever produced. If Har was indeed a former Thunder Warrior, then his story is perhaps the most hopeful of all the Thunder Warrior tales. It suggests that the Emperor's first super soldiers were not inherently doomed, that their genetic flaws could have been corrected, and that they could have been integrated into the Imperium's military structure rather than being discarded. It raises the painful question of what might have been, what the Imperium might have looked like if the Emperor had chosen reform over extermination, integration over elimination, mercy over pragmatism. But the Emperor did not make that choice, and the consequences of his decision echo down through 10,000 years of Imperial history. So let us sit with this for a while. Let us think about what the Thunder Warriors mean, not just as characters in a fictional setting, but as a concept, as a story, as a lens through which we can examine some of the deepest and most uncomfortable questions that the Warhammer 40,000 universe asks of us. The first and most obvious theme is the question of disposability. The Thunder Warriors were created to serve a purpose, and when that purpose was fulfilled, they were disposed of. This is not unique to the Warhammer 40,000 setting, of course. History is full of examples of soldiers and warriors who served their nations faithfully and were then abandoned when they were no longer needed. Veterans returning from wars to find that the governments they fought for have no interest in their welfare. Mercenaries discarded by the powers that hired them. Indigenous allies betrayed by the empires they helped to build. The pattern is as old as warfare itself, and the Thunder Warriors are, in many ways, the ultimate expression of that pattern, the logical endpoint of a philosophy that views human beings as instruments to be used and discarded, rather than as individuals with inherent worth and dignity. But the Thunder Warriors add a unique dimension to this theme, because they were not merely used and discarded. They were created to be used and discarded. The disposability was built into them from the very beginning, engineered into their genetic code at the cellular level. They were designed to expire, designed to become obsolete, designed to die. Every moment of their existence, from their creation to their destruction, was part of a plan that they had no knowledge of and no voice in shaping. They were not merely victims of ingratitude, they were victims of design. This raises a second theme, the ethics of creation. In the Warhammer 40,000 setting, the Emperor is often presented as a being of almost godlike wisdom and foresight, a visionary whose plans for humanity, while sometimes ruthless, were ultimately in service to the greater good. The story of the Thunder Warriors challenges this narrative in a fundamental way. As if the Emperor knew that the Thunder Warriors were doomed, if he deliberately engineered them with limited lifespans and unstable genetics, then what does that say about his character? What does it say about a being who creates sentient life, beings capable of thought and feeling and suffering, knowing from the start that he intends to destroy them when they have served their purpose? This is not a question the setting answers for us. It cannot, because the answer depends on your own moral framework, your own values, your own beliefs about the nature of life, and the responsibilities that come with the power to create it. Some will argue that the Emperor was justified, that the unification of terror and the preservation of the human species were goals of such overwhelming importance that any sacrifice was acceptable in their service, or even the sacrifice of the Thunder Warriors' lives and humanity. Others will argue that no end, however noble, can justify the deliberate creation and destruction of sentient beings, that the very act of creating life carries with it an absolute responsibility to that life that cannot be negated by pragmatic considerations. The Thunder Warriors themselves, or at least the survivors we know about, seem to have been divided on this question. Aric Taranis expressed no ill will toward the Emperor, suggesting that he understood, on some level, the logic behind the decision. But the Thunder Warriors who participated in the palace coup clearly felt differently, seeking not just survival but justice, demanding that the Emperor and his servants be held accountable for what they had done. The 4 Thunder Warriors who served as gladiators in the Moor seem to have moved beyond anger into a kind of weary acceptance, fighting and dying in the shadows of the palace they had helped to build. Their story, a quiet, dignified tragedy, rather than a dramatic confrontation. The third theme is the idea of legacy and memory. The Thunder Warriors were erased from history. Their names were stripped from the records, their deeds attributed to the Astartes who replaced them, their very existence denied and suppressed. For 10,000 years, the Imperium has maintained the fiction that the Thunder Warriors all died heroically at Mount Ararat, a noble lie that serves the interests of the state, but dishonors the memory of the warriors who actually lived and died in service to that state. What does it mean to be forgotten? What does it mean to have your sacrifices denied, your existence erased, your name struck from the rolls of history? For the Thunder Warriors, it means that the civilization they helped to create does not even acknowledge that they existed. The Space Marines who inherited their legacy do not know their names. The citizens of the Imperium who live in the civilization the Thunder Warriors built have never heard of them. The honor and glory that were supposed to be the reward for their service were stolen from them as surely as their lives were stolen at Mount Ararat. And yet, in a strange and bittersweet way, the Thunder Warriors' legacy persists. It persists in the genetic code of every Space Marine, in the organizational structure of every chapter, when in the very concept of genetically enhanced super soldiers as the primary instrument of the Emperor's will. It persists in the fragments of records that survive in sealed archives, in the stories whispered among those few who know the truth, in the persistent rumors and myths that circulate among the populations of Terra's underhive, where some believe that surviving Thunder Warriors still exist, hiding in the deepest, darkest corners of the planet. Their immense forms slowly decaying but still dangerous, still powerful, still refusing to die. There is something deeply human about this persistence, this refusal to be completely erased. No matter how thoroughly the Imperium has tried to suppress the truth about the Thunder Warriors, it keeps surfacing in novels and histories and folktales and the stubborn, yet inconvenient survival of warriors who were supposed to be dead 10,000 years ago. The truth has a weight that censorship cannot entirely lift, and the memory of the Thunder Warriors, however distorted and incomplete, continues to haunt the Imperium like a ghost that will not rest. The fourth, and perhaps most profound theme, is the question of what it means to be human. The Thunder Warriors were created from human beings, men who were transformed through genetic alchemy into something categorically different from what they had been. Were they still human after the transformation? Were they human when they fought with the strength of gods and the fury of storms? Were they human when their minds began to break and their bodies began to fail? Were they human when they were hunted down and killed by the very emperor they had served? But the answer, I think, is yes. They were always human. Not in the biological sense, perhaps. Not in the narrow, technical definition of what constitutes a member of the species Homo sapiens. But in every sense that matters. In their capacity for love and loyalty and courage and sacrifice. In their ability to feel joy and sorrow and anger and hope. In their stubborn, magnificent refusal to be reduced to mere weapons, mere instruments of another being's will. They were human. More human, in some ways, than the Astartes who replaced them, whose emotions were carefully modulated and controlled, whose individuality was sublimated to the needs of their legion and their primarch. The Thunder Warriors felt everything, and they felt it deeply. And that depth of feeling is, in the end, what makes their story so powerful and so heartbreaking. They were humanity's first super soldiers. They were the Emperor's greatest weapons and his greatest moral failure. They were the storm that broke the old world and cleared the way for the new. They were fathers and brothers and friends, warriors and warlords and rebels, heroes and victims and ghosts. They were everything that is great and terrible about the human capacity for creation and destruction, compressed into a few thousand genetically enhanced bodies that burn so brightly and so briefly that the light of their passing still illuminates the darkest corners of the Imperium 10,000 years later. The legacy of the Thunder Warriors is a complicated and multifaceted thing, touching on some of the deepest themes of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. They are, in many ways, the ultimate symbol of the Imperium's foundational hypocrisy, a civilization that claims to value loyalty, sacrifice, and service to humanity, but which was built on the betrayal and murder of its most loyal servants. The Thunder Warriors gave everything for the Emperor, fought and bled and died for his vision of a united humanity, and were repaid with treachery and oblivion. Their names were erased from history, their deeds attributed to the warriors who replaced them, their very existence denied and suppressed for 10,000 years. But their legacy endures, in ways both visible and hidden. Every Space Marine who has ever marched to war is, in a very real sense, the inheritor of the Thunder Warriors' legacy. The Astartes were built on the foundation laid by the Thunder Warriors, by their gene seed technology, a direct refinement of the augmentation process that created humanity's first super soldiers. The 20 Space Marine legions were organized in the same structure as the 20 Thunder Warrior legions. The first Astartes wore the same Mark I Thunder armor that the Thunder Warriors had worn. The entire concept of genetically enhanced super soldiers as the primary instrument of the Emperor's will originated with the Thunder Warriors, and everything that came after. The Primarchs, the Legionnaires, Astartes, the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, even the modern chapters of the 41st and 42nd millennia. All of it flows from the work that the Emperor began in his laboratories beneath the Himalayas when he created the first Thunder Warrior. Yet the Thunder Warriors also serve as a powerful reminder of the human cost of the Imperium's existence. In the Warhammer 40,000 setting, the Imperium is often portrayed as a necessary evil, a brutal totalitarian state that, for all its flaws, represents humanity's only hope of survival in a galaxy filled with threats beyond comprehension. The story of the Thunder Warriors challenges this narrative by showing us what that necessary evil actually looks like at the individual level. These were men, human beings who had been transformed into weapons in service to a cause they believed in. They fought with courage and passion. They sacrificed their lives and their humanity for the Emperor's vision, and when they were no longer useful, they were thrown away like broken tools. The Imperium's survival may have required their sacrifice, but that does not make the sacrifice any less monstrous. And then there is the moral question that lies at the heart of the Thunder Warriors' story. A question that has no easy answer. Was the Emperor right to create them? Was the creation of beings who were destined to suffer and die, who were engineered from the start as disposable instruments of conquest, morally justifiable, even in service to a cause as grand as the unification of humanity? And was the Emperor right to destroy them when they were no longer needed? To murder his most loyal servants rather than find a way to help them, to heal them, to give them a place in the world they had helped to create? These are questions that the Warhammer 40,000 setting deliberately refuses to answer definitively, because they are questions that have no definitive answer. Yes, they are the kind of questions that force us to grapple with the nature of power, the ethics of creation, and the responsibilities that come with the ability to reshape the very fabric of life itself. They are, in the truest sense, the questions that define the setting. The Thunder Warriors knew what it was to burn brightly and briefly, to give everything for a cause and receive nothing in return. They knew the joy of battle and the agony of betrayal, the pride of service and the horror of obsolescence. They were humanity's first super soldiers, the Emperor's first and finest weapons, the storm that swept away the old world and cleared the ground for the new. And in the end, they were forgotten. Erased from history, their names stripped from the records, their deeds attributed to others. The Imperium they had died to create does not even acknowledge their existence. The Space Marines who inherited their legacy do not know their names. The citizens of the Imperium who live in the civilization the Thunder Warriors built have never heard of them. But in the hidden archives of the Imperial Palace, in the sealed records that only the most trusted servants are permitted to read, the truth waits. The story of the Thunder Warriors waits. The memory of their sacrifice, their courage, their betrayal, and their ultimate, tragic end. It waits for someone to find it, to read it, to understand it. It waits for someone to remember. And now you do. You know about the men who were taken from their lives and remade into something more than human and less than free. You know about the warriors who conquered a world for an emperor who rewarded their loyalty with betrayal. You know about Arik Taranis, who refused to die, who outsmarted the very system that had created him, and who carried the secrets of the Emperor's first army into an age of darkness and civil war. You know about the Diet Tar, who fought the warhounds in the tunnels of Cerberus and proved that the Emperor's forgotten warriors were still the deadliest fighters in the galaxy. You know about Ushatan, who sought justice and found only death at the hands of Constantin Valdor. You know about the 4 gladiators of the Maw, who fought for the entertainment of crowds that had no idea they were watching living fossils, relics of an age that the Imperium had tried to erase. You know about Endrid Har, who may have been a Thunder Warrior reborn as a Space Marine, and whose story suggests that the Emperor's first soldiers could have been saved, could have been healed, could have been given a place in the Imperium they had built, if only someone had cared enough to try. You know about the Mark I Thunder armor, the crude and magnificent suits that bore the Raptor Imperialis on their chest plates, the first power armor ever worn in the service of the Emperor. You know about the 20 legions, each with its own specialties and its own character, organized in a pattern that would be echoed by the 20 Space Marine legions that replaced them. You know the story of the Thunder Warriors, and knowing it, you understand something fundamental about the Imperium of Man, about its greatness and its cruelty, its ambition and its hypocrisy, its soaring ideals and its blood-stained foundations. You understand that the galaxy's greatest civilization was built on a lie, and that the warriors who made it possible were rewarded with nothing but oblivion. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not because it changes anything, not because it can undo the injustice that was done, but because the act of remembering, the simple human act of keeping someone's memory alive, is itself a form of justice. The Thunder Warriors cannot be brought back. Their bones lie scattered across the ruins of a world they conquered, mixed with the dust and ashes of 10,000 years of Imperial history. But their story can be told, and in the telling, some small measure of the honor that was stolen from them can be restored. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But before the war stretched to 1,000,000 worlds, before the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy and the Long War and all the rest of it, there was terror. And on terror, there were the Thunder Warriors. They were the first. They were the strongest. They were the most human. And they were betrayed. Remember them. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most fascinating and tragic corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore, consider subscribing to Q on 40K and hitting that like button. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. Stories of the forgotten heroes and hidden truths that lie buried beneath 10,000 years of Imperial history. If you want to learn more about the Thunder Warriors, check out the novels Valdor, Birth of the Imperium by Chris Raitt and The Outcast Dead by Graham McNeill, on both of which bring these incredible warriors to life in ways that are deeply moving and unforgettable. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes, buried beneath all that war, there are stories worth telling. And the story of the Thunder Warriors is one of the most important stories the Imperium has ever tried to bury.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.